I hope everyone's having a great day. We are back. Have more iced tea. Is that peach tea? It takes so long to go through it when I don't drink very much of it, and I'm the only one who drinks it. So I have about a glass left. I might not even finish it. We'll see. That's neither here nor there. Today is Magic Day, and what I wanted to do today was finish out my deck techs. So I've been doing these over the course of a few weeks or months. I don't know how long it's been. Time is nebulous and and hazy. Oh, excuse me. Uh, but yeah, I wanted to get the remainder of my commander decks all up online, all deck teched out, explain my card choices and decisions. And so we're going to be finishing that today. We seem to take about an hour to do any given deck tech, so we'll do two, and these should be the last two. One thing I want to say going into it is that there is a distinct difference I'm noticing when I build a deck, just like put it together, maybe using like cockatrice or something as just a tool for consolidating cards or whatever, as opposed to putting on something like Moxfield, where I can get a lot more breakdowns, where I can instead of just being in a list, I can see like, oh, this is how many of that effect. This is what I have, and especially when I update it over time, a lot of things get kind of lost. It's a lot less. I can be a lot less on top of it, and so more than prior, we're gonna see that coming up today. So, and I think there are reasons for that. When I went over Mayo, which I believe was the first deck tech I did on stream, I know we built Hilda mostly on stream, and maybe I'll do like a deck tech now that it's actually finished and I've been playing it and making changes. But we're not doing that today. With Mael, there was a bit of a difference in that one, some of the numbers were really important to keep track of, and so I was constantly counting them. But also for whatever reason, I just needed to separate that deck out and see what was in it or show it to other people a bunch of times, so I could keep more I can keep a better eye on what was going on. One of the decks we're going to deal with these decks today that's been less the case. One of them that was much more of an issue, and when we get there, I'll like re-clarify that. It was to the point where like I kept changing it for the different like commander leagues I was playing in, which have rule sets that advantage or disadvantage certain things, and I'll explain that too when I get there. And so like I found like, oh, I was missing cards, and there were cards that I was pretty sure were in the deck that I just don't know what happened to, and so on and so forth. So one of these decks is going to be a lot less. Um, well, it's going to be a lot jankier, I guess, which probably explains why I've been kind of unhappy with it recently. But we'll redouble our efforts at some point, and I'll explain the issues as we get there. I can't help but like front load my thoughts on it, even though we're gonna get to it later. So I should probably hold off. Both of these decks, though, are decks that I built with a specific idea in mind. And what I mean by that is that some amount of the time I will build a deck to prove a point, to demonstrate to the people around me something that I had been saying, but they didn't really listen to or understand the value of. We've already seen this a bit with Mael, a deck full of gigantic monsters that if you don't disrupt is just going to put out way more power than what you're going to be able to do. The point was, hey, maybe you should play Wrath Effects. Now, when I was putting that deck together, part of it was like, oh, I've played this deck before, I wanted to rebuild it. But I was also playing with a lot more casual players, people who like had learned to play Magic at F&M with me within the last several months, like very, very, very new players. And so, like that kind of advice, like when I was trying to prove a point, the point was one of those like everyone learns to this stuff, and like they're still playing draft chaff removal because that's what they have. And okay, fine. These decks, the point is very different, but both of them were built to prove a point, and where they've gone is also has also like shifted a bunch. So the first of these is my most competitive deck. This is the deck that when we were going over the like 10-point scale for commander power level, which if you're a CDH player, I think makes a lot of sense, and if you're not, is nonsense. Um, this is the closest to a 2. It's not, and there are reasons for that, and I do want to improve it for what it's worth. I don't want it. I want this to be my best deck, and I want it to be like, all right, are we trying? Then this is what I'm up to. It already kind of is that, but because that's the role it's filling, I want it to get stronger. So this one, more than any other deck, I want to be really critical about, and that includes like anyone wants to comment or whatever. If you want to like tear it up, please. We're no mercy. We're being very strict about what we're trying to accomplish. I haven't done a lot of the work that could be done, but Commander is a format that like kind of goes on in perpetuity. We're not done. I will have this deck for a while. We'll make changes. We'll do that work eventually, or estimate the value of that work. And I'll explain what I mean when we get there. So this deck is for Tatyova Benthic Druid. I wish I could. I wish I could like change how we display stuff, but it's fine. Moxfield is designed for you to look at the deck, not for you to do a deck tech for content. That's not how it's designed. Maybe if what I should do is, well, I guess it's too late now, is when I categorize this stuff, when I make these tags, I should put a number in front of them as far as the number I want it to be in the order. Well, in any case, uh, Tatyova Benthic Druid. The reason I built this in the first place were twofold. Well, let's read the card. 3 green blue, 3/3. Legendary creature Merfolk Druid. That the 3/3 and Merfolk Druid do not matter. When a land enters the battlefield under your control, landfall. Read landfall. You gain 1 life and draw a card. So this is not optional, which had been a problem in the past. It is not a problem anymore. So we don't have to worry about that very much. We don't have to worry about that anymore. The point is, you want lands, you want to hit your landfalls, right? You want as many lands coming into play as possible, right? The reason I built this were a couple of reasons. I already mentioned that it was to prove a point, and I'll get to what that point was in a moment. The other reason was I kind of like the idea of uncommon commanders. It's less strange now because Wizards is printing more legends at uncommon. Very often they're signpost uncommons for the format, which means, well, there's already a strategy that they imply, and some of them are going to be better at those, and enough better at that it's worth playing them as a commander. Tatyova, if I remember correctly, was not a signpost uncommon in Dominaria, but she was really cool, and I was like, this seems really powerful. The other reason was the point I was trying to prove. The group that I had played with a lot then, though I don't play with so much anymore. Not that I have a problem. Like, we're still friends. It just lives change, and like we just don't meet up to play Commander very much. Uh, they were really combo heavy. They aimed a lot higher on the scale. Oh, so I said a 2 or a 3. I was mixing up the thing. This is the closest to an 8 or a 9. I was just reversing the scale. I just realized what I was doing. They aimed a lot closer to like 8 power level, and I find that I have the most fun at like 6 or 7. Like 5 to 7 is where I think Commander becomes the most fun. For me at least, I have a lot of thoughts about fun. I've done a lot of like internal philosophizing about it. We won't get into all of that now. Let's just hint at my enormous nerdiness, and I'm sure no one is surprised. We're doing deck techs for Commander. Uh, but one of the points I wanted to make was like, hey, isn't it kind of shitty and boring when your opponent takes 15 minutes to finish their turn? You're not guaranteed to be dead, and then like whether you are or you're not, you're just like, well, that sucked. And if you are dead, you're just like, why did I have to sit through all of that? So that was like the initial point. On top of that, a friend of mine was playing the Gitrog monster at the time. Now the Gitrog monster is a very similar deck. I should have Gatherer up. so we can like reference cards when we need to. Oops, I should be able to spell it. The Gitrog monster is a very similar kind of deck in that it is land based and it cares a lot about being able to play extra lands. In fact, you may play an additional land on each of your turns is a literal line of text on the Gitrog monster. But the main engine is very different, right? It's at the beginning of your upkeep, sack it unless you sack a land, and when one or more lands goes to your graveyard from anywhere, draw a card. So this deck gains massive. It needs to get lands into play because you're sacrificing them, and like that's part of your game plan. But you actually get value out of sacrificing them. You're trying to get them to the graveyard, and um, and so there were a couple of things going on. The way you attack Gitrog Monster as a deck is a little bit different than a lot of other decks, which is why it was annoying for us to deal with, because the best ways of attacking this deck are going after lands and going after graveyards. Well, going after lands is just kind of shitty. Like when we sit down to play a game, we want to play the game. If I am getting land destruction to the point where I just can't play it, do anything, I could not play the game without sitting down. You know what I mean? And and so it's just one of those like it's considered a little sacrosanct. That's not to say that you shouldn't ever destroy lands. It's just one of those like if you're going after someone's mana base, if someone can't play the game like Blood Moon type effects are usually only CDH for that reason, right? It just it's not that it's punishing me for playing utility lands that are getting me an advantage. It's punishing me for playing colors in a format where you're highly incentivized to play at least two, but frequently three colors. So like Blood Moon effects are a way of attacking it, but there's a lot of collateral damage and it just kind of sucks. The other way of going about it is attacking the graveyard, which like there are some answers to in these colors, right? If you have an enchantment that goes after the graveyard, they can maybe destroy it or whatever. And so like that was one solution I had for a while. I played Leyline of the Void and Dokkan for a while. I in fact only changed it recently because I was like, I never play with him anymore, let alone against the Gitrog monster. And while this card is useful, it's more of like this weird tech card in case it matters, rather than something that is complementary to the game plan. Though we can reappraise that because like getting not having to worry about graveyards is helpful. Whatever, it's not the point. That was my initial response, but then my subsequent response was to play Tatyova, which, by the way, absolutely dumpsters the Gitrog monster. And the reason is a little different than what I just laid out as the way to attack the deck. Instead of attacking the deck, it does what Gitrog is trying to do, but in a much more beneficial way. Gitrog gains value by destroying its own board, sacrificing lands. We gain advantage by playing Tatyova by playing our lands, developing our board. If I have start a turn with 5 lands and end the turn with 8 lands, I have like my I've gotten a lot of value. But for Gitrog, they need to like start the turn with 5 lands, then go to 4, then go to 7, then go to 6 to get a similar amount of value. Which puts me way ahead. Every time I play against my friend's Gitrog monster with this, he can't win. You just can't like we just go way over the top way faster because our synergies are also synergistic with what is normally strong in the game, where he has to sacrifice stuff to get that same advantage. So like that's a little bit of the evolutionary history of the deck. The last thing, the like last big update that changed with this was a little bit of the approach. I had already been off of some cards, and I guess I might as well talk about this later. Or might as well talk about this now. So a lot of um, one of the like most cited cards for this deck is Rampaging Balos, right? It's a landfall effect. Oh, cool. You're already trying to do landfall. What does it do? When a land enters the battlefield under your control, you get a 4/4 beast. That's a huge amount of power. You're trying to trigger this 4, 5, 6 times a turn in the ideal cases. Isn't that a huge amount of value? I was already off of effects like this for a long time when I made the change I'm about to describe to the deck. The reason being, people are already kind of incentivized to get Tatyova off the board. If you have to recast her every turn, it makes it really hard to do that and keep accelerating. This is a losing fight for someone trying to do that because we play enough lands in a turn, or we get enough lands into play in a turn where like you're not going to keep me off of it eventually forever, and eventually you'll run out of removal spells, and I'll just have all these land. Like we can just go from there, and you've just spent a lot of time and effort kind of uselessly. But it becomes a lot less detrimental to the player trying to do that if you're wrathing my board, because you're picking up any other threats that happen to be around. It picks up my creatures that let me play extra lands. It picks up opponents developing creatures, whatever else. And so the Rampaging Baloth type effects just played directly into that. I found that I just didn't untap with a Rampaging Baloth unless I only had like one token. And then it was making other demands that I didn't feel were helpful, which was that if I don't get to untap with Rampaging Baloths, that means I need to play it, make enough power with it where it's substantial, and attack in the same turn. And because we're not just attacking with one creature, we want to attack with a lot of creatures, it kind of requires Concordant Crossroads as a card. But I don't get that much advantage off of haste. I'm mostly a combo deck. It's only things like Rampaging Baloths, now Scute Swarm, which didn't exist at the time, Avenger of Zendikar, things like that really benefit from it. Otherwise, I'm just giving my opponents reach, and I'm playing this dead card. Or sorry, not reach, haste. And I'm playing this dead card, which is only there to facilitate other cards that aren't working. It felt like kind of a sunk cost thing, throwing good money after bad. And so I was already off of this plan. I just took out a lot of this stuff. My win condition was very, very different. And so there came a time when I was playing with a different play group. I had moved temporarily for work, and the local LGS, the way they did Commander was a little different, and so I was just like, okay, every time I sit down with a table with people, I'll ask them, and if you sat down at a table with me, I ask this a lot, how hard are we trying? Get a sense of like, do people want to play the CDH game? If they do, that's okay. I think Commander is not best when it's at a specific power level. I think it is best when everyone's on the same page about how competitive they're trying to be. Now, that's very difficult to establish, but you can get a sense of that. You can ask people like how hard they're trying. And I found that the answers I was getting were super inconsistent and weird. I get some people who are saying, oh yeah, I want to try hard, and then later cast literal Scathe Zombies. And I remember this because it was like wild to me that it was happening, and like this guy said he was trying. Now maybe he probably thought he was trying, and I don't want to be mean, but like for a casual player that doesn't really know what I'm asking, they might think they're trying really, really hard, and here they are with this casual deck to the point of like they're just playing cards that have always been bad, you know? And then I'd also get people who are saying, oh, I'm not trying really hard, and they're playing CEDH as a combo, and they're like, oh, I don't have literally Cloudstone Curio when I asked about it. I asked them, they're like, oh, you're on Cloudstone Curio or whatever. They're like, no, I don't have that. They had a land that lets them pick up their commander. It's like, okay, you're doing what I thought you were doing. You were just like, well, lying to me about how hard you want to try, and then also hiding in the specificity of like, I asked about Cloudstone Curio as opposed to any combo engine with Zakama. And so my response was, okay, I'm just going to play Tatyova, and what I'm going to do is I'll modify the deck so that it interacts with my opponents as little as possible, something that I generally don't like when people do in a deck. I think interaction is really good, as we'll get to later. But what it allows me to do is if I win the game without ever interacting with opponents, and my opponents are on Scathe Zombies, I can say, you know what, my bad. I thought we were trying to play a lot more powerful a game, but since no one else is effective, why don't I concede? Because there was nothing on the line for winning or losing at this game shop. Why don't I just concede, let you play so you can have the fun of playing? And then if someone is trying really hard, well, then they can get dumpstered, right? That was the idea. So there are a lot of card choices in this deck that could change and probably should change, but I haven't like put active effort into this deck for kind of a while. It's mostly just tweaks from here. But now that it's here on Moxfield, well, it becomes a lot easier to put active effort into it. So I'll probably do that going forward. I know there are some cards I'm going to want for this deck, and they're in the considering. We'll talk about that when we get there. But for now, just understand some of how we got to where we are. The first thing is the basics. This deck requires a huge number of basic lands. You're going to be searching for these all the time. I have run out. I have run out many times. I run out a lot less now because I used to be playing cards like Sky Shroud Claim and Explosive Vegetation. Cards like this where it's, 4 mana. I keep misclicking. 4 mana, get 2 lands from your deck. Sky Shroud Claim gets 2 forests untap, Explosive Vegetation gets 2 basic lands tap, things like this. I thought that that's what was going to be the bread and butter of this deck. As it turns out, the more I played it, it didn't take very long of playing it before I was very off of it. They don't line up with actually how I want to play the game. So I haven't run out of lands as much, but the other reason we run out of lands a lot is fetch lands are crazy good. I don't have all of them just because I just currently don't have like polluted delta, and for what it's worth, blue fetches are significantly worse in this deck than green ones. I know I'm missing Verdant Catacombs as well. It's just fetches I don't have and I didn't buy. The Terramorphic Expanse and Evolving Wilds should probably be replaced by those. They could also be replaced with some other stuff, which I'll talk about later. They're also just kind of okay. They mostly suck in the very early game and the very late game, but in the middle, you can find a moment to sneak them in. But what they do is pretty awesome. You play it, trigger Tatyova, draw a card, gain a life, crack it, get another land, draw a card, gain a life. You're up 2 cards. So your land has draw 2 cards, and depending on which land it is, gain 1 or 2 life. But because of the presence of all these fetch lands, it's not just the lands we're pulling out of our deck with rampant growth type effects. It's also these fetches. So like you need a lot of basics, and honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if I need more. The split is probably incorrect. This was done mostly on field. Remember, this wasn't on Mox Field. I wasn't like running numbers about blue pips and green pips, and there's a lot of other stuff to consider. I do know that we need a lot more forests than islands, but the exact amount we can mess with that. This is something that scrutiny definitely needs to go towards. What I haven't talked about, I guess, and maybe I should, is what the actual game plan is. The game plan is get a lot of value through hitting land drops, yada yada, etc. Okay, now what do we do once we get there? We can draw a huge amount of our deck. We'll start at the bottom as opposed to at the top, and that is our win cons. We're trying to win the game with Thassa's Oracle or Jace Wielder of Mysteries. I don't know why Thassa's Oracle was fine, but Jace was moved up. Yeah, that's very strange. Both of which are basically, hey, is your deck empty? You win the game. They function slightly differently, but for the most part, that's what they do. I think these are better than Laboratory Maniac. If I wanted a third one of these, I could put that in, but I think 2 is fine. I have had an instance where someone attacked me with Ulamog, the new one that exiles the top 20 cards of your library. Exiled my Jace, and I had to spend the rest of the game like keeping track of where my Oracle was to make sure it didn't get exiled too, because then how do I win? That's a little bit of the problem of not having the Rampaging Baloths plan. I think this deck could use another plan. I just am not convinced that Rampaging Baloths is the right one. Maybe it is, and I'll get back to why. Because I think Concordant Crossroads might be good in the deck now for different reasons, but we'll get back to that in a moment. And then, so these are the primary win cons. Now I put Genesis Wave here because this is deceptively kind of in this a third copy of these cards. If I cast Genesis Wave for like 30, which is very doable in this deck, I've cast it for a lot more, but 30 is like a good number, and I have, say, 40 cards in my library, as long as Jace or Thassa's Oracle is in those 30 cards, I'll also have enough lands come into play off of this Genesis Wave that Tatyova will draw me the rest of my deck and let these win the game. With 10 cards left in my deck, that's a little dangerous unless I know where these cards are, which we have some amount of library manipulation. Not a ton, but some amount. So we can affect that. But frequently it's just if I can cast Genesis Wave for my library, it wins the game on the spot. That's not exactly the case for what used to be considered another win con in my deck, which I'll go find right now, which is Blue Sun Zenith. The difference, of course, is that Blue Sun Zenith, I need to draw no more than the number of cards in my deck, then cast one of my win conditions. It's still a really good card, but it doesn't function as cleanly as a win con as Genesis Wave, so that's why it's not there. So that's the plan. How do we get there? Well, the big way we get there, obviously, is by accelerating. So I have multiple categories of acceleration here. The first one is what I call growth effects. I call it like rampant growth. The only problem is ramp is it means something else in Magic. It's just any sort of mana acceleration. Um, so ramp will mean something else, and we'll get to that. But growth is just cards that pull lands out of my deck. There aren't as many as I'd like, but unfortunately, they're just not a lot that are efficient enough. If you'll notice, not a lot of these cost more than two, right? I'm counting crop rotation in here because it's important to note that while it doesn't increase my land count, it does pull a land out of my deck. There are a few important lands that crop rotation will get. Excuse me, that it will get. Maybe I shouldn't start here. Maybe I should start with my lands. It's a little confusing. As I'm a little uncertain about the correct order to display this deck because there are a lot of interlocking pieces. So you know what? Actually, we're gonna talk about our lands. One land that I think will be important to get with crop rotation is Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth. The reason for this is again like kind of kind of weird and circuitous, but if I have Yavimaya, fetching islands becomes a lot better, which is good because there are cards that care about forests being in my hand, and I'll get to that when we get there. The other lands that we might sometimes want to get are like Reliquary Tower, pretty rarely actually, and where are the rest of my lands? Getting fetch lands is pretty good, right? Crop rotation for a fetch land is the baseline. Crop rotation says draw two cards, and and I sometimes gain a life or two. Where are my utility lands? Are they at the top? Are they in the combo pieces section? Okay, the other lands that are important to get. Okay, yeah, are Oboro. I have the Buckleberry Fairies. That's it. It's this one. Legendary land. This is massively important for the game plan, and so is Simic Growth Chamber, and I'll explain why after I read what they do. So legendary land taps for blue. One, return it to your owner to its owner's hand. The other is Simic Growth Chamber. It enters the battlefield tapped. When it enters the battlefield, return a land you control to its owner's hand. Tap, add green blue to your mana pool. Both of these do something pretty important, which is that they return themselves to the hand, which certain combos in this deck kind of require to have happen. Ghost Town is similar in that vein, but it doesn't work in the way we need it to. Ghost Town is a land, it adds a colorless, and you can pay 0 to return it to its owner's hand, but you can only use it during an opponent's turn. So while this is helpful for certain things, it is not like the combo engine in the same way these two are. So like I'm not going to crop rotation for Ghost Town, but I will crop rotation for Growth Chamber or Buckleberry Fairy. Um, Maybe I should explain the combos. No, I'll explain the growth stuff. I'm sorry. I know this is I don't have like a clear approach for how to explain this, but like I said, it's because everything is interconnected. As I saw those cards, I was realizing there's like 3 or 4 other things that need explaining. There's a lot of interlocking pieces in this deck. So let's just talk about what growth effects I have. Obviously, we have the 2 mana ones: Nature's Lore, 3 visits, Rampant Growth, easy. And Emergent Sequence. The one thing I'm kind of annoyed about Emergent Sequence is it's not optional to make the land a creature. I'll often lose track of how many lands have entered the battlefield this turn, and I don't really want it to be a creature. It's just that this is another Rampant Growth. So far that hasn't really come up, but I wish it wasn't a creature. It's supposed to be like I guess it's not supposed to be strictly an upside, but I think it's supposed to be. Well, mostly an upside on the card. But as it turns out, in this deck, it's kind of a downside because we're not attacking. Like the power and toughness doesn't really matter, except that now this thing can die. What other stuff do we have to pull lands out of the deck? Well, things that pull multiple lands out of the... Oh, we also have Wayfarer's Bauble here. It's 3 mana, which is a little unfortunate, but we can offset when it happens. And like I could understand an argument that maybe this should be something like Nissa's Pilgrimage, a card that just came out of the deck actually. This is a card. I don't know if I currently have it as cuttable. Oh yeah, I do. This is one of the cards that maybe this is a little suspicious. We also have Colony Heart Expedition. This card I'm a little on the fence about because we do run out of lands, and sometimes you find it late into a turn where you're doing massive amounts of landfall, and you're like, can I even get this into play? Like it's 2 mana, do nothing, and then you need to get 3 lands into play before it does something. Or sorry, is it 2 lands? No, you have to remove 3 counters to get 2 lands. That's what it is. That said, there is a portion of the game that I have to keep an eye on, which is the portion of the game before Tatyova enters the battlefield, wherein we do want to accelerate our mana, but we also don't want to spend all of our acceleration and our fetch lands and whatever else. We want to hold as much of that as possible. So what Colony Heart Expedition lets me do, at least in theory, is play it on turn like 2 or 3, play Tatyova after this already has the counters ready to go, sacrifice it immediately, and get value from Tatyova. It's probably worthwhile in that it gets 2 lands for 2 mana. It's just the fact that it's very frequently I draw it in parts of the game where I can't really get it to work and it feels like a dead card, but I guess some things are like that. Myriad Landscape is in a similar vein. If we have the time to do it, especially early in the game, that's great, but later in the game, it's kind of hard to justify a lot. It becomes easier to justify if we have Amulet of Vigor, so this is less likely to get cut, I think, but these are the most awkward ones. What else do we have? Well, at 3 mana, we have the best of them is Harrow. 2 and a green, instant, sack a land, search for 2 basic lands, put them into play, shuffle. So this gets 2 landfall triggers. It only accelerates us once, but it gets 2 landfall triggers, and with Harrow specifically, those lands come in untapped. It only costs you 1 mana effectively on the card. Crop Rotation is similar in that like you're not ahead on lands, but it doesn't cost you any mana since you can tap a forest, sack the forest, get another forest, and you're even on mana. So this is -1 on mana the turn you cast it, which is really good for getting 2 landfall triggers and accelerating. The other ones don't do it quite as well, but obviously they're not going to print more things like Harrow. Instead, we have Roiling Regrowth, which is the same except they enter the battlefield tapped. Endless Restoration, which is Roiling Regrowth, except if you have a creature with 4 power or greater, you get a 3rd land. That actually almost happened to me the last time I played this deck. I actually had a 4 power creature, which isn't common, but my Endless Restoration got countered because it represented way too much value. Accelerating twice and getting 3 cards all for 3 mana. It was hard for my opponents to get behind letting that happen. And we have Spring Blue Druid, which is Roiling Regrowth, but stapled to a 1/1. The 1/1 doesn't really matter. It's just we want more of this effect. And like, they chump block sometimes. Sure. Last of the growth effects I haven't talked about is Avatar of Growth. I'm a little on the fence about this, but it was such a pain to get a copy that I kind of don't want to cut it, even if it is bad. 4 and green, which is not actually what it costs. 4/4 trample. The only thing that matters about that is now we have Entish Restoration, so 4 power is cool. It costs 1 less for each opponent you have. So this is actually, in an average game of EDH, 1 green. So for 3 mana, you get this 4/4. The 4/4 part doesn't matter. But when it enters the battlefield, each player searches for 2 basic lands and puts them onto the battlefield, untapped. Now, I know it's giving my opponents mana, but we do way more with it. First of all, it draws us 2 cards. But even if we don't have Tatyova in play and we just like have to give our opponents each 2 mana, we're gonna use that mana to make more mana and combo off. Like we're gonna go over the top of whatever they do. I don't love giving my opponents mana, but I don't hate it either. Actually, in that vein, I do want to consider. We'll add Veteran Explorer to our considering pile for that reason. The problem is I don't have a way of getting it into the graveyard, except people letting it die. That said, a lot of opponents will probably be on board for letting it die. We'll figure that out. And then the last one is Collective Voyage, which is in a similar vein. It gives my opponent's land as well. We'll read this one out because it's weird. Green for a sorcery. It's not actually just one. Um, on resolution, not as part of the cost. That's why it's not X and a green. Starting with you, each player may pay any amount of mana. Each player searches their library for up to X basic land cards, where X is the total amount of mana paid this way. Puts it on the battlefield tap, then shuffles their library. So people have questioned me on this card of like, oh, is this like group hug stuff? No, the point is that again, we're gonna do a lot more with this mana than they are. I have cast Collective Voyage for for where X was greater than the number of basic lands left in some number of players' decks. That said, we have to keep an eye on how many we have left, and now that this deck is on Moxfield, I know I have 30 of them, which is really important. But also, like, if this is 2 and a green, get 2 lands tapped, that's already better than something like Cultivate. It's pretty close to Roiling Regrowth, if not better. The trade-off is that my opponents get lands, but again, we're going over the top. So this is like, I'm not going to say this is an all-star of the deck or anything, but I think it's definitely earned its place. Additionally, if we have Amulet of Vigor, this card becomes absolutely insane. And remember, this is also a draw X if we have Tatyova. I've mentioned it a few times, so I might as well like make sure we know what I'm talking about with Amulet of Vigor. This is really important to the deck for a couple of reasons. One of them is just the incidental value I've mentioned already. 1-mana artifact, whenever a permanent enters the battlefield tapped under your control, untap it. So with Collective Voyage, it effectively only costs me 1 mana to get as many lands out of my deck as I can pay for, right? Basically like doubles my land count, which is really, really good if we have the Amulet of Vigor. Now that said, I'm not always going to have it early, and I frequently don't. So it's not in here because I know I'll have Amulet of Vigor so much as like when I do, this card is not a card I need to defend the existence of as much as it is like a Boundless Realms for one, you know? By the way, that's another kind of card that's not in here. It used to be, but it just gets way more lands than we actually need. So instead, it's kind of like get lands to enter the battlefield as many times as possible, as opposed to get a lot of lands to enter once. Just because it's a lot easier to cast these 2 and 3 mana spells than it is to cast Boundless Realms. And we don't have to do a ton of work to get there. I want these to get me where I want to go. I don't want to have to get to the cards that will get me where I want to go. There's another category of a mana development is where'd it go? Shouldn't it be here? These seem to be in order. Did I not? Oh, I have a little bit of acceleration in like Soul Ring and Temple of the False God. By the way, this deck is the reason why I said Temple of the False God is not always a trap. In this deck, we're gonna get to 5 lands. If this doesn't tap for 2 and quickly, we're losing the game anyway. So why not have a soul land that basically doesn't cost us anything? And then we have Soul Ring. There are other categories for extra lands though. So extra land drops. So this is like kind of 2 categories of cards that will give me extra land drops. There are the consistent versions, things like Exploration, Azusa, Dryad of the Elysian Grove, Wayward Swordtooth, Oracle of Moldiah, whatever. Like, it lets us play extra lands consistently turn to turn, which is really, really good. By the way, Wayward Swordtooth was the random 4-power creature I had in that game I was just telling you about for Entis Restoration. Getting extra land drops means that we can draw more cards, get Tatyova triggers. Playing more lands every turn is really, really good for us. This is also why this deck has so many lands. I haven't mentioned that yet. This deck has, I think, 48 lands. I'll change my my deck view so we can take a look at the card split. I've been questioned about this a little bit. I started this deck with 40 lands, and it was just not nearly enough. And since then, I've added a lot more things that strain the land count, like a lot more of these fetches. So these 48 lands, I run out a lot, and usually I run out of lands in hand. So I just want to have access to a lot of them. If we're trying to hit extra land drops, I want to be reasonably certain that I have a land in my hand. So yeah, basically half the deck is lands, and that's intentional. And for what it's worth, there are some number of hands in this deck that, even though some number of I think I want to rephrase that. This deck can win with a land heavy hand, but it probably can't win with a hand light hand. We don't want to see a 2 land hand, but a 5 land hand is great. I have won a game with a 6 land hand on turn 5, killing the table. Like, um, obviously for CDH, it's not the fastest kill, but for non CDH commander, like that's pretty fast. So we have a lot of lands to make sure we can hit these land drops, and we need to, because like this is a huge source of value, especially consistent value, whether Tatyova's in play or not. And these can like these kinds of effects are also nice. Is like, okay, we can accelerate our mana into Tatyova and then play Tatyova and these keep letting us get extra lands into play, as opposed to Rampant Growth, which I have to make a decision, right? Do I cast it before I get a card so I can get to Tatyova quicker, or do I play it after so she takes longer to come out, but I get a card out of it? So the like extra land drop effects are just the best of both worlds. They're fantastic. The one that's really weird that I haven't mentioned yet is Gaia's Touch. This is green enchantment. You can play an extra forest each turn, and you can also sacrifice Gaia's Touch for double green, which is really nice because once you're done with it, you can just get your mana back. I have in some games played my extra forest and sacrificed it all in the same turn, which basically meant it was 0 mana, get an extra land drop. That's pretty cool. However, it does require you play an extra forest. So that incentivizes me a lot to try to not to leave forests in my deck, so that if I find Gaia's Touch, I'll have the extra forest to play, where I couldn't play another land. Also, the way this card works specifically is a little weird, because it's not just play any land. You have to indicate which land you're playing is the extra one from Gaia's Touch, which also means that if you lose control of the Gaia's Touch, that doesn't like count towards your land drops later in the turn. If I'm not mistaken, someone can correct me on that. It's a like really weird edge case of like, let's say I have Wayward Swordtooth, Gaia's Touch. I go play my extra forest with Gaia's Touch, play an island, sacrifice the Gaia's Touch, or sorry, not play 2 islands, play 1 island, sack the Gaia's Touch. Am I allowed to play another land? I think I am, but it's a little nebulous. Whereas if it were Wayward Swordtooth and Oracle of Moldiah, and like you play 2 lands, then the Oracle dies, no, you can't play a 3rd land. So that's whatever. There's also the category. Oh, and then Burgeoning is the last one I haven't mentioned, is consistent land drops. This is what makes Ghost Town important to have. Burgeoning, we will sometimes run out of lands for this. Green enchantment, whenever an opponent plays a land, they have to play a land. It's not landfall. They have to like use a land drop for it, kind of thing. You can put a land from your hand onto the battlefield. Oboro, Simic Growth Chamber, and Ghost Town all let me hit infinite land drops with Burgeoning, with all off of having that 1 land in my hand. I don't have to worry about drawing enough lands to refuel the Burgeoning. That's, if anyone's ever played with this card in Commander, that's a common thing, a common issue that occurs of like, okay, you play Burgeoning, you play 3 extra lands on turn 1, and then it never does anything ever again. Now that's still a huge advantage, but now the card's done. With this deck, it's not done, and I want to make sure that I'm never going to run out of land. So we have a few cards that help us do that, though they have other value otherwise. The only exception is Ghost Town. Only really synergizes with Burgeoning. I guess it can synergize with one other card, but in an extremely weird way. But it's a very, very low cost in the deck. The other category of extra land drop cards are the ones that do it once. So that's Growth Spiral, Broken Bond, Explorer, and Uro. Uro is actually a lot weaker in this deck than I thought he was going to be when I first saw him. It's basically a 3-mana Explorer that sometimes is a 4-mana Explorer later. I don't know if I've ever attacked with him. If I ever attack with Uro, he's very much worth the spot. If I ever get a 3rd trigger out of him in a game, he's insanely good. A 2nd trigger is like pretty good, I guess, but I pay a lot of mana for it. But the 3rd one would be insane. It just doesn't really happen that much. Though it is nice as like a resource that I have access to when I start to putter out, because this deck does have some amount of fail rate problems. Also, as a note, I got Alex Bertuccini to sign my copy of Explorer, which is kind of funny to me, and he also thought it was funny. So, in fact, he suggested it. So, I can't show it. it here, obviously, because I can't just like upload the image, but it is neat that I have a signed Explorer, but not signed by the artist, signed by someone who, well, was doing things he shouldn't have been doing with that card. Uh, this is not a, I'm not condoning what he did, just saying it's funny to, like, we can have a sense of humor about it now that he's no longer doing that. Okay, so those are the ways we get more lands into play. There is one other last category of getting lands into play, and that's extra land tappers. I didn't have another way of putting it. Creatures that tap to put a land from my hand onto the battlefield. There are probably more of these. I have to find them. I'm not actually sure. Actually, I think I did a search yesterday and found that these are like the best ones. I don't want to pay more than 2 mana for these, and even paying 2 mana is a little unfortunate. But such as they all do the same thing. They all say tap, put a land from your hand into play. The only difference is Sky Shroud Ranger can only do it at sorcery speed, which, like sometimes that's a problem, but not usually. Um, Scaled Herbalist, Llanowar Scout, and Walking Atlas are all 2 mana, and uh, Scaled Herbalist and Llanowar Scout have 3 toughness. Those are the only differences, and it doesn't really matter very much like anything else. I guess Sky Shroud Ranger is an elf, and so is the Llanowar Scout, and there's a card I'm thinking about putting in that will care about that. But for the most part, they tap to put a land into play. These cards are surprisingly good, in particular the 1 mana ones, but I need a glut of them for a reason I'll get to in just a moment. Sky Shroud Ranger, by the way, is the card that was in that 6 land hand I was mentioning before, where I won on turn 5. I went turn 1 Llanowar Scout. On turn 3, I could play my commander. On turn 4, I do a massive amount of accelerating. Turn 5, I continue that and win the game. And I think I played some other. I think I drew some other spell to play on turn 2, but I don't remember what it was. And so having all those lands in my hand was super important, and these cards make it even more important to have lands in your hand. Well, these are a little dorky as cards. What are they doing in the deck? Well, part of it is Sky Shroud Ranger is kind of like an Oracle or like a Wayward Swordtooth, right? It lets me play an extra land each turn, but as opposed to it being playing a land, it's putting it into play. But this is cheaper. So these are kind of more extra land drop cards. Some of them can even do it on opponent's turn. So you know, uh, if I draw an extra card somehow on an opponent's turn, which is possible to do, I can put a land into play with these. Incidentally, Walking Atlas is a card that's kind of a pet card of mine. In fact, mine is signed because of that. You might notice something weird on the card if you haven't seen it before. If you don't notice it, I'll give you a second to see if you can figure it out. But there's something wrong with what's written on this card. And part of why I like it is because it is one in 3 out of 4 consecutive sets in Magic. There were cards that needed a day 1 errata. This was one of them. And the mistake on the card is this card is from Worldwake. Eldrazi weren't a thing yet. Every card that was colorless was an artifact, and in fact, in the Oracle, this is supposed to be an artifact, but they forgot to write it on the card. I jokingly argue that Shatterstorm should not kill my Walking Atlas, but Whip Flare should. Nobody ever listens to me, and it's not really important. I just think it's funny. I've mentioned one of the other cards prior, and that's Elixir of Immortality. The third one is Glint Hawk Idol. If you want to look that up and figure out what's wrong with it, I'm not going to go over it right now. We're already taking longer than I thought we would with this deck tag. It's fine. I don't have anywhere to be, so we take as long as we take. So the other reason these are in the deck, and by the way, the existence of these cards in the deck does kind of make me want to put in Concordant Crossroads, because having to wait a turn for them sometimes means they're bricks when they could be winning me the game. And why do I say they could be winning me the game? Well, this is the first combo that we found, and that's Retreat to Coralhelm with these land tappers. So it's 2 and a blue enchantment. Whenever land enters the battlefield under control, choose one. You may tap or untap target creature or scry one. So the scry one is nice when I don't have one of those creatures going, because it smooths my draws a little bit. I can just sequence it such that it's Tatyova is now scry 1 draw card every time. That's usually how I do it. I don't want to do scry 2 draw card, because you have to decide the order you're doing it before you start any of them. So it's usually scry 1 draw, scry 1 draw. That's kind of nice, and it doesn't hurt. I would not play this card if that's all it did. And in fact, I used to have Retreat to Kazandu, but that was way too weak because it just doesn't do very much on landfall. The thing that this does do that's really important, though, is it can untap one of those creatures that tap to put a land in, which means I can tap it again, put another land in. As long as I have lands, I can keep doing this. Now, Tatyova is also drawing me a card every time. So if every card I draw is a land, then I can keep going until I run out of lands. Alternatively, I can just play out the lands in my hand, however many lands I find. Alternatively, Oboro and Simic Growth Chamber, when I play them, I can pick them up again and then play them again. I can play them infinitely, which lets me draw my deck. That's one mechanism by which we can enable Thassa's Oracle, Jace, Wielder of Mysteries type stuff. Also, Abundance, while just normally good in this deck, synergizes with this game plan in the event that I'm still looking for Oboro or Simic Growth Chamber. Because, so I'll read this card because it's a little bit weird. 2 green enchantment. If you would draw a card, you may instead, so you're not drawing cards anymore. That's really important for stuff like Orcish Bowmaster and stuff. You may instead choose land or non-land, then reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a card of that kind, of the chosen kind. Put that in your hand, and the rest on the bottom in any order. The any order part is not super relevant. It can be though. But if I'm going off with this combo and I haven't found the Buckleberry Fairy or Simic Growth Chamber yet, I can, if I have abundance, I can simply choose to draw a land every time, which lets me play every land in my deck, which will eventually find these two, and then we can go properly infinite. That's part of what this is doing here. It's also just really, really useful. We end up drawing a lot of cards, and there's a lot of redundancy, but also sometimes like, well, I have all these cards that let me play extra lands. I just need to find the lands. Okay, I have a bunch of lands. I just need things that let me put them into play. Like, abundance is actually very, very useful in this deck in a way that you would often say is like, well, isn't everything just good? Like, isn't this good in just every deck? Kind of, but it's important enough where I feel like it is specifically good in this deck as opposed to just a generically strong card. Not to mention that it does combo with Retreat to Korham. I guess while we're on the subject of infinite combos, I've only not talked about one part of another infinite combo in this deck, and that's Patron of the Moon. You might be wondering what this random 7-mana creature is doing here. By the way, it has Moonfolk Offering, which there used to be exactly one Moonfolk in the deck that we could use it for, but it's since come out, and that was Moloku, because Moloku also works for this. It also basically lets you turn a land into Oboro, but she just didn't do enough, and she ended up coming out. So, Patron of the Moon, 5 blue, 5/4 flying. The 5/4 flying doesn't matter. Moonfolk Offering doesn't matter. Don't worry about it. It says pay 1, put up to 2 lands from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. So this takes a little bit more work because I can't just put in the Growth Chamber, pick up the Growth Chamber, and go and keep doing that ad infinitum. It costs me a mana each time to do that. And with Oboro, it costs me 2 mana. I have to pay an extra 1 to pick it up. With Amulet of Vigor, though, it does pay for itself. In fact, with Amulet of Vigor, Patron of the Moon, and Simic Growth Chamber, it's infinite mana as well. The problem that actually comes up is that Tatyova will draw your deck. That actually used to be a real problem for me, is that in the process of making that infinite mana, I would run out of cards in my deck because I'm drawing a card for each mana I make. And my old win condition used to be to Blue Sun Zenith all of my opponents, which I could do. I could get there. Now it's just easier to use Thassa's Oracle and stuff. And so I had to have, part of what the deck used to have was a way of getting Tatyova off the battlefield because she'll kill me otherwise. This is another thing that Abundance does for the deck, which is I don't draw cards anymore. So even if I run out of cards in my library, I will choose instead. I'll search. I'll get the next non-land. Oh, there aren't any. Cool, move on. And I don't have to worry about decking out. But that's much less of an issue now. Now we don't have to worry about that at all. Decking out is the game plan. In fact, Blue Sun Zenith is no longer a win condition for that reason, because I was like wondering, didn't this used to be a win con? I actually forgot that the reason it was a win con was because I would point it at all my opponents for their library plus whatever. There's one other card that protects me from decking, and I guess I might as well talk about it now, which is Scroll Rack. Scroll Rack doesn't actually draw cards. It's 2 mana artifact, 1 tap, put any number of cards from your hand aside, then put that many cards or it's like exile that many cards from your hand face down. Then put that many cards from your library into your hand, and put the cards you set aside into your library in any order. So what you can do is, like, let's say your library has one card and your hand has 20, 30, 50 cards. You can say, all right, I'll activate Skull Rack. I'll put 50 cards aside. I'll put that one card left in my deck in my hand and put the rest of the cards back. Now you're down cards in this exchange, but if we're going infinite, like, that's fine. And I used to need to do that. Now I don't, and now maybe this card is actually cuttable now that I think about it. Though it does help me with card smoothing, which is what this pile is. I guess I might as well talk about that. Echo of Eons is the last card in that category we haven't talked about. I will sometimes like sputter out and just need a reset, and so I used to have different draw sevens in here, but now it's just Echo of Eons. Uh, so those are the main. So those are the infinites the deck can come up with. There's also this Kodama of the East Tree, which isn't. I didn't know where to put this other than a combo piece, even though it doesn't specifically combo with anything. It's not an infinite. It's just massive amounts of value. So what this is 4 green green 6/6 reach. Whenever whenever another permanent enters the battlefield under your control, if it wasn't put onto the battlefield with this ability, you can put another permanent from your hand onto the battlefield that costs with equal or lesser mana cost. So because it allows equal or lesser, that means whenever I play a land, Kodama lets me put another land into play. If I Rampant Growth, Kodama lets me put another land into play. If I cast Retreat to Coral Helm, I can put like Wayward Swordtooth into play. I can put another land into play. It basically gives me a massive number of extra land drops. I think I've had it in exactly one game, and it was better than how good it sounds right now. It's that good of a card. That's why it's here in combo engines, because it's basically a combo piece, even though it's just combo with what this deck is already doing. There are a few other odds and ends, so I just want to make sure. Jace, by the way, I don't love casting him early, but you can, and he draws cards. I usually mill myself because I have Echo and Uro, and I'm trying to deck myself anyway. There's not a whole lot in my deck that I need to make sure never hits the graveyard, or like desperately need to make sure it hits my hand. And we have a little bit of recursion, which we'll get to, that helps us deal with that. So like the mill up myself is usually better, and it avoids the risk of other people having graveyard synergies. We talked about the draw smoothing. We talked about the extra land drops. We talked about the tappers, the fetches, the fixing. So the fixing in this deck, you'll notice, is mostly the fetches, and the fetches are only kind of fixing because I only have Breeding Pool as far as a land that is both an island and a forest. If I owned a tropical island, it would be in here. I don't. I am pretty disinterested in playing the lands that enter tapped and just are the basic land types. There are a couple of those. There's the snow one. There's a snow one and a not snow one at a minimum. I think the artifact indestructible ones also have the land types, but I don't remember. There's an argument that you could cut like Evolving Wilds, Terramorphic Expanse for those. So the like Flooded Strand is more fixing. Frequently, you can get away with just getting a basic and save the Breeding Pool for when you desperately need to have your blue fetch make green. This is part of a difficulty of the deck. Of you want to leave forest in the deck for Gaia's Touch, but green is more important for what you're trying to do, and like having too many islands in play actively gets in the way of casting your spells. This is also why when I cast the Harrow type effects, I'm in crop rotation, things like that, I'm usually sacrificing an island because I don't need as many as I end up with. Dryad of the Elysian Grove is a recent addition, and it's only a recent addition because of the weird process, like the weird events of my game shop and like the process of getting these decks updated. Basically, there was a benefit in the league point system where if you have 5 lands with 5 colors, you get an extra point during that game, and a different deck was the deck I was playing for that league. So I just put it in there and just forgot to put it back into Tatyova until now. So this card is probably exceptional. It does everything I want it to do, but I haven't played with it yet. And by the way, this and Yavimaya are like, when we get back to, oh yeah, fetching islands is something I'm kind of incentivized to do for Gaia's Touch, but they don't make green. These solve that problem. And so Yavimaya is probably a card I'm going to be searching for a lot more. It's usually like Search Oboro is the best one. Simic Growth Chamber is only better than Oboro if we're on Patron of the Moon specifically, and um, and especially if we don't have the Amulet of Vigor. But otherwise, Oboro is better, and it synergizes with more stuff. Um, it like sometimes Reliquary Tower, and I guess Yavimaya is going to be a card that I want to be searching for. Uh, we also have a little bit of interaction. So as I mentioned, I trimmed a huge amount of interaction in this deck because, well, I shouldn't say a huge amount. I didn't have very much to begin with, but I trimmed a lot of interaction in this deck because I was trying to make it so if I grossly like if I grossly misdiagnosed the power level that we were trying to play at, like I wouldn't ruin other people's games as I leave. We do need a little bit of interaction. Cyclonic Rift isn't that great. It's mostly just like we'll get to 7. Like 7 is very doable. The big problem with Cyclonic Rift is I want to spend my 7 mana on development more often than not. So that's why it's a little it can be something else. We probably should have more interaction here. The only reason Broken Bond is here is because it also is an extra land. It's naturalized, but instead of instant, you get an extra land drop, which is pretty cool. We also have some land tutors. This Teleria West, it ends up being kind of like I don't think I really need it anymore. We can probably cut this, probably just for like a basic forest. Oh, I forgot I didn't finish my thought with the fixing. Notice there's not a lot of fixing here that isn't fetches. Like I don't have command tower or whatever else. The problem is like basics. I need to have a lot of basics in my deck. If I cut a basic for command tower, well, command tower isn't fetchable, so it doesn't help me. And and it cuts the number of basics in my deck while also giving me an amount of fixing that isn't that helpful. I'm going to be able to play my cards most of the time. Mana problems are more as far as sequencing. Like I have to think about it, not my deck can't make the colors I need. It does. It just I have to put more thought into it because it's not my lands only make one color most of the time. So I don't have a lot of other fixing because I just need the number of basics. They don't help that much, and I'll have so many lands in play that I can make my colors. It just makes me think more, and while that could be an advantage to playing those, there are strategic disadvantages, like there are deck building constraints that they fight against, the number of basics in particular. So yeah, as I was saying, we have some number of land tutors. Teleria West probably can get cut. I think it's on the cuttable list already. Yep. Sylvan Scrying Expedition Map, crop rotation. Now that I'm realizing more how important Yavimaya is, I'm probably not going to cut more than just like the Teleria West. I had it come up before where like I just don't need to fetch these out, and Expedition Map is the worst of them. But I guess if Sylvan Scrying and Expedition Map are what I'm relying on to find the two important lands in my deck, it's also more okay because crop rotation, getting a fetch land, is just so good. So having these 3 is probably enough. You know that I don't really like tutors, which is why this deck is also still built with a minimum number of tutoring effects, and it's only really for lands, which is, well, it's important for how the deck works. I can't really search anything else. Instead, the approach was massive amounts of redundancy. This is probably the thing that keeps it from being more CDH. I should probably have ways of searching this stuff up. Like, maybe I should have Worldly Tutor to find, like, Sakura Tribe Scout so that I can do whatever. But, like, I don't know if that's worthwhile. There's also some amount of mana doubling. I keep coming back and reappraising what should be in here. It's kind of rough because like spending 6 or 7 mana on this is a lot, especially because unlike other decks, I don't have that much in the way of artifact mana. It's not worthwhile to play artifact mana except for Soul Ring, because if I'm spending 2 mana on a talisman, I'd rather spend 2 mana on getting a land out of my deck, right? The land will draw me a card with Tatyova, right? So the amount that I have to spend on this is a lot. If I ever that's mostly a problem in a turn where I have to play that in the same turn that I'm comboing off. That said, they do make tons of mana, and I do like them. I think they are really good. I can see the argument for playing more of these. The big difficulty is that I don't get Mirari's Wake, which is 5 mana, but it's white. A lot of the cards that do stuff like this, that are cheaper than these, don't work on all of your lands. So like, is it Verdant Growth? There's some card. It's like 4 and a green enchantment. Forests tap for an extra green, or like whenever you tap a forest for mana, make it green. Okay, I could play that, but not all of my lands are forest. And as I just said, there's a big issue of like having to have a lot of islands in play. Now with Yavimaya, that could work, and maybe I can play like Gauntlet of Power for that reason or whatever. But it is like something it's a difficulty. I would like maybe one more of these. I used to have like Zendikar Resurgent, but at 7 mana it was such an issue, and the forced draw on casting a creature was actually kind of an issue. I also kept thinking it was a different card entirely, um, and did something completely different. So that's out, and you'll see there is one idea for what I should put in here instead. But these are obviously the absolute best at this. Mana Reflection, just doubling the mana, is only relevantly different than Mirari's Wake in that it applies to Sol Ring, and it also makes like Temple of the False God and Simic Growth Chamber tap for 4 as opposed to 3. That's not super relevant. Like if I could play Mirari's Wake instead, I would. I'd rather pay one less and have like the 3 cards not make an extra mana than the other way around. But I think this is the cheapest version. These are the this is the cheapest version, and this is the most powerful version of this kind of effect. So that's what we have. We also have a little bit of recursion. Here's my sweeper. We have Eternal Witness and Regrowth. Eternal Witness is like kind of a staple, and one of the things I realized was that the 2/1 doesn't matter to me. For a lot of decks, it does, but for mine, it's just a blocker. It's never going to do more than that. I don't really have ways of interact. I don't have blink. I don't have anything to do with a creature other than get it into combat, and I don't care about combat. So and at that point, I realized, why not just play Regrowth? It's cheaper and does what I want it to do. And because of the existence of these 2 cards, that's why I'm not super worried about milling stuff with Jace. Like, sure, I could plus Jace, mill both of these, and now I don't have any recursion anymore. Except that's also not true. We still have Echo of Eons. Yeah, so like, just have a little bit of recursion. Sometimes you have an important effect that you want to get again. Yeah, it's easy enough. And these are the cheapest version of that. That's also why there's no Timeless Witness. And I think I used to have Green Ward and a Marasa because, like, well, I can cast the 6 mana thing, but why do I want to spend 6 mana when I can just spend 2? I don't care about the 5/4, and getting it killed will be a difficulty unto itself. So these are my recursion effects. I could play like Recollect or something like that, but I don't think I need more than this. We also have some untap effects. As it turns out, there aren't a lot of these. So we have our first the other Planeswalker in the deck, and this is, I go back and forth on this a lot. It has effectively one ability that I care about. So she's 3 green green, 3 loyalty, +1. Target land you control becomes a 4/4 creature until end of turn with trample. It's still a land. Oh, sorry, it's not until end of turn. Just becomes a 4/4 with trample indefinitely. It doesn't untap that land, and I don't really care about the 4/4, so we don't use that ability. It also has +1 untap 4 forests. That's what we use it for. The turn you play her, you're still -1 mana, but the next turn you're +4 mana for having her. We'll have the 4 forests, and if I ever have a mana doubler, she makes more than that. I think she is really weak, actually, but I don't know. Maybe she's good enough. Maybe she can come out. I think she's in the cuttable list. No, she's not. Yeah, I don't know. I've always been really uncertain about her presence in the deck, but if you ever get if you don't if you get to untap another time, that's cool. The problem is I want to not need to untap more than I have to. I want to pop off and win in the same turn as much as possible. Frequently, this deck will have like accelerate a little bit, play Tatyova, have a huge resource gathering turn, just like resource development, like get a bunch of lands under me, get a bunch of cards, set up, probably be unable to win, pass, and then do something huge the next turn. I want to not have that pass and do something huge the next turn as much a part of the intentional game plan, which makes Nissa a lot worse. Though it does make these other cards exceptionally good. Some of these you might not have seen before, some of them you definitely have, and they're doing something. Sometimes they're doing something a little different. Turnabout is frequently not untopping your lands, but that's what it is in this deck. 2 blue, target player. It's like you choose target player, and then on a resolution you choose whether they tap or untap, and then you choose if they do that to artifacts, creatures, or lands. This is just untap my lands. All right. Early Harvest is a card I was surprised to discover. I didn't know about this. Also, it's had a reprint, so it's like kind of funny that I didn't know about this card. But it's really good. It's 1 green green instant. Target player untaps all basic lands he or she controls. This is another reason why I want to have mostly basics as my mana base. Early Harvest untaps those, it doesn't untap the other stuff. Cool. By the way, with all of these untap effects, even if I don't have a mana doubler, spending 3 to untap 12 lands is still, this is a 9 mana ritual, right? That's still really, really good. And it gets better and better, especially with Regrowth and Eternal Witness to get them back. That's how I want the deck to end a game, is do a huge amount of development with Tatyova in play, cast an early harvest or some big untap effect, use that mana to develop more, and also regrowth that early harvest, build again, like, and just like have a couple of these cycles, basically force a new turn with early harvest. This is kind of a time walk, and then play my win, do whatever win con stuff I need to do. And then the last one is Rude Awakening, and I say this for last because it's actually the worst of these effects, even though it looks like it's the best. If you've seen this card before, you've probably seen people do it to do exactly what we're doing here, which is untap my lands. Usually they'll do it with mana doublers, but there's an expectation that the Entwine matters and that the other option matters, and it doesn't. So this is 4 and a green sorcery. Choose one, untap all lands you control, or until end of turns, lands you control are 2/2 creatures that are still lands, and it has Entwine for 2 and a green. Problems with the reason why that Entwine and that 2/2 creature thing are not actually real. It doesn't give the lands haste, which means that I don't get to, like, if I have to keep track of what lands enter the battlefield this turn, and those don't get to attack, which greatly diminishes what is how much power this thing actually represents. Okay, let's say all of my lands can attack anyway. Am I gonna have enough lands to attack all of my opponents for 40 or more? Maybe less, but like, no. In I'll have to like spend my whole turn on that, or the rest of my mana on that, for that big attack, and then I'll have to do it again the next turn if it's going to be a real plan. It's not. It's just not a real plan. This is also why was it Sylvan Awakening, I think is the card. It's like 2 and a green, your lands become 2/2 indestructible hasting creatures until end of turn. Like, that is a better version of this effect, even though it doesn't untap my lands, because I can just, that can, sure, I pay 3 mana for it, but at least they have haste. But that's not a real win condition. It doesn't actually work. If it gave vigilance, like, if Rude Awakening give vigilance and haste to those lands, oh, and indestructible, like, then like, sure, sometimes I'll do it, but obviously that's way too much to ask for the card. So before, like, just because I know people have a lot of questions of like, oh, this is a win con, right? No, it's not. It just isn't. It doesn't work well enough for that. So that is the deck and like the general plan. I didn't go over what I'm considering cutting other than when I came across it. I think I've talked about all the cards for sure. Yeah, so the cuttable stuff. Um, Evolving Wilds is here, but Terramorphic Expanse somehow didn't make it. So give me one second. The reason why I am a little on the fence about Terramorphic Expanse and Evolving Wilds is, well, the positive first, right? They get either a forest or an island, which not all my fetches do. So maybe coming into play tapped is a price we can pay. And like, if we have Amulet of Vigor, it's not a price at all. That's true, but most of the time I don't have Amulet of Vigor. In which case, a land entering tap kind of sucks, especially if it's the really early turn. Like, if this needs to be the land that casts Tatyova, it messes with a lot of sequencing stuff, because I want to, maybe I want to go play Scaled Herbalist on turn 2, and that's the turn where I drew the Terramorphic Expanse, and then turn 3 I want to like, do something else, like spend my mana on some other way. I'm not thinking of a sequence that exactly messes with it, but I might not have a moment to play it before Tatyova, and then it sometimes costs me a turn is the big problem. This is why Myriad Landscape is here too. I actually used to have more lands like this. There's I think it's like Blighted Woodland. It enters tapped, taps for color, maybe it taps for green, I don't remember. But 3 and a green, tap sack, get 2 basic lands tapped. That used to be in here when I had a lot more like explosive vegetations and stuff. It's just way too slow, and the tap land is a real cost. So that's why I'm really on the fence about these. I've mentioned the reasons for all the other stuff, but this is the stuff I'm on the fence about. And then the things I'm considering. There are actually a lot of cards. Some of these are cards that just definitely should be in the deck, and I don't know why I didn't think of them. Some of it is the landfall stuff. That's Lotus Cobra, Nissa Resurgent Animist, Tireless Provisioner. These are all cards that I don't know how, like, well, Nissa didn't exist yet, and neither did Tyler's Provisioner when I built this deck. But like, I don't know how they dipped under the radar. I think with Lotus Cobra, I think what happened with Lotus Cobra is that at the time I thought the deck would have more of a combat finish than a combo finish, and so I was like, well, I'm getting the lands into play. What do I need this to make a couple extra mana for on that turn? I'll just develop on the next turn, which is not how the deck works anymore. So these cards definitely just need to go in. I'm just gonna get copies of them and put them in. Crucible of Worlds, I'm back and forth on. It helps a lot with it. Like if I have the fetches, it means I can keep hitting land drops indefinitely, and that's really good. But if I don't, it doesn't do much. I don't have like Wasteland, Strip Mine, anything like that. And even if I did, that wouldn't be my game plan. I'm not going to try to strip mine all of my opponents. I'm going to try to combo finish over the top. So maybe this can be good. I'm not really sure. Blossoming Tortoise, this is something I came across when going over the EDH rec last night when I was putting this and the other deck up on Moxfield. So this is 2 green green 3/3. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, mill 3 cards, then return a land from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So the fact that it does this on entering the battlefield is what makes me consider it. It does hit a land drop, even if I don't mill a land in those top 3 cards, which I should. They're about 50% of my deck, almost closer to like 49. Um, but even if I don't, maybe I have a fetch land in there, and like, okay, cool. It enters tapped, which is a little annoying. It's less annoying, or it's more annoying if I hit Terramorphic Expanse or Evolving Wilds, but if I don't, I don't really care that much. So it's another landfall trigger. I guess if that's all, like, if that's all it is, it's probably worse than Farhaven Elf, which I currently don't have in the deck. You can see here it's in considering. Just because this is a 3 mana ramp, like why pay 3 when I'm paying 2? But the thought is, well, what if I just want more of it? So maybe it is worthwhile. It needs to attack to do it again, which, like, if I ever get an attack and I get 2 out of this, like, that's pretty good, I guess. But I guess that's a slower and not even as good explosive vegetation. The thing that's like, maybe it's good. Okay, it gives your land creatures +1/+1. We don't do that here. But activated abilities of lands you control costing 1 less to activate makes Oboro actually make mana if I'm like, let's say I can have like Oboro, a creature that taps to put a land in, and this thing. Oh, sorry, and retreat to Coral Helm, I guess. So that's 4 cards. Ugh. And even if I don't have my commander, that's infinite blue mana. Nah, it's probably not good. The more I talk about it, the more I'm like, I actually don't. I'm actually just kind of off it. So I'm gonna take that out. I also have Farhaven Elf and Wood Elves hanging out here. I think Wood Elves is more likely to make it than Farhaven Elf. Just like, maybe I just want more of this effect. There isn't really a lot more at 2. I don't have cultivate type effects because, like, I don't know. It's 3 mana. I get 1 land into play. The 1 land in my hand is nice, but I don't know. It's just not really efficient. The thing I used to have, and that's why it's hanging out here, is Nissa's Pilgrimage. I just cut it yesterday for the Dryad of the Elysian Grove. The thing that this does a little differently is it gets me more lands, right? So it's 2 and a green sorcery. Search your library for up to 2 basic forest cards. Reveal them, put them in your hand, put 1 on the battlefield tapped, the rest in your hand, shuffle. So it's basically just worse cultivate because it has to get forest, but okay, forest is more important anyway. But it has spell mastery, which we have a lot of instants and sorceries. I haven't shown you the number, but I can do that in a second. If you have 3 or more, it gets 3 lands instead. Now it puts the other 2 in your hand, but I mean, having 2 land drops is important in this deck. I did like the card. Maybe, like, I mean, I did just cut it, so clearly I thought it was the worst card in the deck. But, you know, we'll reappraise. It's in considering because I'm not sure. So, like, let's take a look. We have 12 sorceries, 9 instants, so we have 21. 22 with the Nissa's Pilgrimage, but I guess we can't really count that. And then that's another reason why Jace would mill me, by the way, was getting Spell Mastery for the 1 card that cares. I don't know. I go back and forth. It's currently not in the deck, but it's in considering. Tiller Engine is a card I want, but I just haven't been able to find a copy of. It's another Amulet of Vigor. It also, unlike Amulet of Vigor, makes mana off of untapped lands. This is a 2 mana artifact creature. It's a 1/3. When a land enters the battlefield, oh, it has to enter the battlefield tapped under your control. My mistake. So Oh, okay. So I guess it is just another Amulet of Vigor, but we could use more of those. You can choose one, either untap that land or tap target non-land permanent and opponent controls. We're probably not going to do that second thing, but another Amulet of Vigor is nice. I just haven't been able to find the card. And then the card I added while we were talking was Veteran Explorer. It's green for a 1/1. When it dies, each player may search the library for up to 2 basic lands, put them on the battlefield, and then shuffle. They come in untapped, and your opponents get it. So and it has to die. The opponents getting it isn't that big a deal. Getting them untapped is really cool if I can get it on my turn, but I don't have a way of getting it into my graveyard other than going to combat, and that means an opponent has to let me do this, and like maybe they just won't, right? Some players will be like, well, I want the land, so I might as well, and then some players will say, I'd rather take one than let your landfall deck accelerate. So I don't think this is good, but I thought of it as we were talking, so we'll put it on there. Uh, Druid class is probably not good, but I figured I'd consider it. The it has landfall at its base level. It's landfall gain a life, which we already kind of have and we don't really need. It is nice that Tatyova gains life, but it's not that big a deal. Um, but also when you have it at level 2, you can play an extra land each turn, and then we'll just never level 3. I guess it's just a 5 mana exploration, and we don't need the life gain. Okay, yeah, yeah, that's not good. Spelunking is a card that I'm actually pretty interested in. This is 2 and a green. When it enters the battlefield, draw a card, then put a land from your hand on the battlefield. That's so it's 3 mana Explore. I don't love 3 mana Explorer, but it does more than that, which is lands you control enter the battlefield untapped. So for our purposes, that is the same as an Amulet of Vigor. So it's an Amulet of Vigor stapled to an Explorer. I like it. Virtue of Strength was the card I was talking about as the mana doubler that I'm probably gonna just add to the deck. It's new, so I didn't consider hadn't considered it yet, but it seems good. The adventure part is green. Return a creature or land from your graveyard to your hand. The creature part can be useful if my like Spring Bloom Druid dies, or I just want to or my Eternal Witness dies, or I mill one of them or something like incidental value. More likely, it's picking up a fetch land, but that's pretty good, especially in the early turns, which is when I'd want to cast this. If like maybe I play a Terramorphic Expanse on turn 1, turn 2 I can get it back, play it again, and like build up to my Tatia. That is really slow. I don't love doing that. But like maybe Misty Rainforest instead or whatever. That can help me make sure I hit land drops in the turns before my lands come with extra cards. And then the enchantment part is 5 green green, so expensive, but like still, but it's basically Nyxborn Ancient. If you tap a basic land for mana, it produces 3 times as much, and most of our lands are basic. So it's less vulnerable than Nyxbloom Ancient because it's not a creature. It's the same cost, though notably less green mana, which makes it a little nicer to cast. And it comes with an attached adventure that has some value. I'm gonna get a copy. We're gonna put it in the deck. Joint Exploration. I'm considering this is basically 3 mana Explore, or I guess it's 3 mana Growth Spiral. The only difference is it has a Scry 2. Maybe that's worthwhile. I don't think so, but like we can consider based on like as compared to our cuttables. Oh, of course they're at the top. I forgot it's alphabetical. Oh, excuse me. Like I don't know if it's better than these. It's probably worse than Wayfarer's Bauble, and at that point, yeah. All right, we'll just remove it from the. But I didn't want to talk about it in case like anyone wants to like share their thoughts about this deck in the comments or Discord or whatever. I need Boseiju. It's an expensive card. I'll get it at some point. These cards were the things I was thinking about as maybe could be alternatives to Terramorphic Expanse Evolving Wilds. Uh, they both do basically the same thing. Promising Vein is a cave, which Spelunking cares about. You gain 4 life if you put a cave onto the battlefield with it. That doesn't actually matter, but like these might be worthwhile. They both do the same thing. They come in untapped. They tap for a colorless. You can pay 1, tap, and sacrifice them to get a basic land from your deck. They effectively cost 2 mana to get a land. Oh, and that puts the land into play tapped. The fact that it costs 2 mana is probably the deal breaker for me. It costs 2 mana to get the land out of your deck, but at least they come in untapped. No, okay, never mind. If it was just like if it just was tap sack it, no, then it would be too much better than those. Yeah, I don't know. And then I'm thinking about Ren and 7. This could be really, really good. +1, reveal the top 4 cards of your library, put all lands from them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. As mentioned, I don't really care about the mill. My deck is also 50% lands, so I can expect to hit at least one, sometimes two or three lands off of this. It also has 0, put any number of lands from your hand onto the battlefield. That can be really good. There are some draws where I've drawn too many lands and not enough cards that let me play them. So this fills both halves of that. If I need lands, it can help get them. If I have lands, it can put them into play. It also makes a giant blocker. -3, make a tree folk with power toughness equal number of lands you control with reach. That can occasionally be useful, but obviously I want it for the +1 and the 0. And I don't even remember what his ult does, but that's not what we play Planeswalkers for, right? You're not reliably going to get there. It's return all permanents from your graveyard to your hand, and you get them emblem with no maximum hand size. Sure, if we ever do that, we win the game, but we're probably not going to do that. And the last card I haven't talked about in the considering pile is Far Wanderings. This one's a little weird because, like, I guess if I put Wrenn and 7 in the deck, it gets a lot better. It's 2 and a green, sorcery. Search for a basic land, put it on the battlefield, tap, shuffle. So it's a 3-mana rampant growth. That's pretty bad. But there are a lot of these kinds of cards where if you jump through a hoop, it's better than that. This is the only one that I'm currently considering because of what the payoff is. If Threshold, if there are 7 more cards in your graveyard, which we can do, like we have a lot of rampant growth type effects, a lot of instant sorceries and fetch lands that fill our graveyard. Instead, you get 3 basic lands and put them on the battlefield tapped. My worry is that this is already like, it needs me to already be firing on all cylinders, but when I am, it is an exceptionally good card. Before I get Tatyova into play, I guess the thing is, it does go from 3 to 5, so like, that's pretty good. It should probably go in the deck. It's probably better than Wayfarer's Bauble, which is the same amount of mana to get 1 land. The Bauble you can spread over 2 turns, which is nice. And instead, the Far Wanderings has a much higher ceiling. So that's probably going to go in. But that's Tatyova Benthic Druid. As I say, it is a combo-oriented game plan. We are trying to Thassa's Oracle the hard way. We don't put... Someone saw that in my deck and they're like, wait, what? Because they're confused. They're not seeing Thassa's Oracle next to Demonic Consultation. Like, I literally can't play that card. I was like, no, we're doing it the hard way. We're going to Genesis Wave or Blue Sun Zenith for our deck and then play the Thassa's Oracle or the Jace Wielder of Mysteries. We have other ways of doing that. As I mentioned, there are 2 main infinite combos that the deck has access to. I'm going to add Concordant Crossroads to my considering pile because there are a lot of games, as I mentioned, where I'm doing my big development turn, and if these things had haste, it would be my combo infinite turn. But since they don't, I do have to pass. So maybe Concordant Crossroads is good enough for that reason. And at that point, maybe we consider 1 landfall power maker like Paging Baloth or Skewed Swarm or something. But currently, I don't have the means of doing that. I could use more interaction as well, but we'll need a lot more like active thinking about this to get there. I haven't really put a lot of effort into this deck in a while, but it does work really well, and it is pretty competitive. I don't think the deck can win on turn 4. If it can't, I think for it to win on turn 4, you have to have like exactly Soul Ring and a pretty specific like series of cards. But turn 5 is very doable. Turn 6 is likely. And then if we get to turn 7 or 8, it's because we're being interacted with, which is fair and all. So that's Tatyova Benthic Druid. It took us a little longer than I expected, but I also just talked a lot, and this is a lot of interlocking pieces. I hope it all makes sense. Now we can get to the other deck text, since we have a lot more time on our... Oh, I forgot. I gotta unprivate my deck now that we've talked about it. The other deck that I wanted to talk about is the one that needed all those caveats at the beginning. This is a deck that I had played in a bunch of these commander leagues at my local game shop, and because of the rule sets, I kept having to swap cards in and out, and I lost track of some stuff, and like I was apparently missing cards. Apparently I haven't played this deck in a while, so it's not like I was cheating or anything, but apparently it was like 97 cards, including the commander. I'm like, I have no idea where those 3 cards went. I don't know what was going on. There was a lot of weird stuff. In fact, like when I cut the Dryad of the Elysian Grove that I mentioned was in there, I didn't see the card that was supposed to that I thought the card that I thought I took out for it was already in the deck, so I have no idea what I took out. It was really weird. So this deck needs a lot needs a lot more active effort put into it, but there are some difficulties with doing that, which I'll get to at some point. Um, I do like the idea of the deck, I just haven't put a lot of thought into it in a while, so I'll need to do that kind of soon. I'll go through my stuff and see what I can do to tweak it. But the deck is Vaevicis Asmati the Dire. This is a card that, oh boy, are you going to have to read a lot. I understand how it works now because I played with it a lot, but people ask a lot of questions about it because it's a lot less straightforward than you think. When you play with it, you realize all the questions you have about how its effect works. So it's 3 black, red, green, 6/6 flying. When Vaevicis Asmati the Dire attacks, for each player, choose target permanent that player controls. Those players sacrifice those permanents. Each player who sacrificed a permanent this way reveals the top card of the library, then puts it on the battlefield if it's a permanent card. This is more or less Chaos Warp for each player on each attack, but it's not exactly that. And there are quirks to it that are super important. You sacrifice the thing. It doesn't go back into the deck, so it ends up in the graveyard, and it's sacrificed, so it gets around indestructible, yada yada, etc. You choose it, but you choose the target, so it still targets. It doesn't get around hexproof or shroud. It doesn't shuffle the library, so whatever's on top is on top. If you set up something to be there that you can flip into, it'll be there. You're not going to shuffle in between. You only get the thing if you sacrifice the targeted thing. So if for example, I wouldn't do this, but like, let's say I target someone's fetch land. If they sack the fetch land in response, they don't get the card off the top. If they hit, like Chaos Warp, if you reveal a non-permanent, you just get nothing. It just stays up there and we move on. Which is also why it's important that it doesn't shuffle, because any case where I get multiple Vaevicis triggers without the top card in my opponent's library changing, which could happen in a couple of ways, they just keep getting nothing. The idea behind this deck, the point I was trying to prove, as I mentioned earlier, this was one of those I'm trying to prove a point type decks, was that interacting with your opponent is good. You should do it. Interact. This is the most interactive deck I think I've ever built. It is, I am going to mess with you all the time. You need to, and you'll see how good it is when you do that. And if you're not interacting with me, all that's going to happen is I'm going to take your board apart. And that's built into the commander, but also into a lot of the card choices in the deck. Something else to note is a constraint I put on myself that I think is justified, but not necessary, which is that I wanted to never miss with Vaevicis. As I mentioned, if you reveal a non-permanent, an instant or sorcery, you just don't get it. You just don't get anything. Because I wanted to never miss, there are no instants and sorceries in the deck. This is mono permanents. This is sometimes an issue at a minimum because I have no instant speed interaction because I have no instants. There are cards that could allow me to interact at instant speed, but I haven't really found any that are worthwhile. Even that are still permanents, but I haven't found any that are worthwhile. I could play like Vidalcan Orrery or whatever, so I can cast my stuff at an instant speed or whatever, but that's not currently where we are. That is a huge constraint, by the way. That said, I sometimes think well, I don't have to do that. I could put in an instant, a couple instants and sorceries, and it probably won't mess with me most of the time, and it shouldn't be much of an issue. But then I go, well, what would I put in here? The number one option is Primal Surge. A card that used to be in Mael, actually, and that deck had this constraint only because of this card, and then that's since changed. 8 green, so casting that is not easy, but we can do that. Exile the top card of your library. If it's a permanent card, you may put it on the battlefield. If you do, repeat this process. If this is the only instant or sorcery in your deck, you just put your deck into play. I was thinking about this a little bit yesterday because a friend was suggesting it to me. I just don't think that this deck wins the game if it does that. It's too built around consistently interacting with your opponent, and it's like I'm trying to jund them out. If I put my deck into play, it's probably not enough to just win. It doesn't have some over-the-top... Mael is if I put my deck into play, I put 200, 300 power into play. It's not nothing, you know? Maybe not that much, but we're putting hundreds of power into play. Um, right? If I have 30 creatures, each of them is 5 power. It's at least 5 power. Yeah, it's at least 150 power, not including buffs. This is not gonna do that. A lot of my creatures are interactive. They're not there for their power and toughness. So there's that. One difficulty this deck has is also that ending the game is kind of tough. I don't have like a great way. I basically just have to go to combat, and commander damage is a big part of my game plan, just because I want to be attacking with Vaevicis every turn. And then that also means there's an extra problem of he has 6 power. 6 power is like the worst amount of power to have on a commander, because it's enough where you should be trying to do commander damage, but it also requires one more attack than 7 power. So there are also some cards I have to have in here, basically just because they give him an extra power. Uh, and then otherwise, like, I have more stuff to attack with, but the basic idea is we're taking apart our opponent's boards thoroughly enough where we have the time to attack with our creatures and get them dead. There's a lot. One thing I do really like about this deck is that it rewards you for having really good threat assessment. And not just between opponents, because you get something from everyone, yourself included, by the way. It's not optional. Sorry, I forgot to mention about his trigger. It is not optional, and it is not up to one. When he attacks, you are picking something from everyone, yourself included. One, which is actually something I sometimes don't like. If my opponent is just on like 3 or 4 basic lands because like I accelerated or maybe they have a slow draw or whatever else, I don't like going after their lands, but I don't have a choice. Uh, but the threat assessment that Vaevicis rewards you for is, instead of for which player is the biggest threat, which you do have some amount of, it's who you choose to attack. It's what is most important on their board. You don't get to take all of their cards with his attack. You get to take one per attack, which means sometimes you have to find which of their 6 important permanents is actually the one holding everything together. Now, that said, if your opponent has 6 important permanents, things are already starting to go wrong with this deck, but sometimes it can't be helped. People go real big in Commander, so. All right, so let's make our way through the deck. Again, I don't really have like a focused way of going through it. We'll see what makes sense, and we'll make sure to talk about every card. I do know that the first tag that we have here is things that enable 7 power. It is enough of a concern where some of my card choices are geared towards that. Now, I'm not going to put a card on my deck just to give him an extra power. But if it gives an extra power as compared to a card that doesn't, it makes it that much better. The signature card for that fact is Rising of the Day. This is a newer one. 2 in a red enchantment. Creatures you control have haste. Legendary creatures you control get +1/+0. Like, before Rising of the Day was in the deck, I had Fires of Yavimaya. One of the like go-to cards for giving all of your creatures haste. Creatures you control have haste. Sacrifice it. Target creature gets +2/+2 until the end of turn. Here's the problem. +2/+2 on Vaevicis is never going to get him to hit the threshold, because 3 attacks with Vaevicis at 6 power is 18 damage. +2/+2 puts it to 20 commander damage. You need one more, so this doesn't actually help. This text doesn't exist. It basically just says creatures you control have haste. Well, Rising of the Day also gives him that 7th power. Cool, great, awesome. Same thing with Invigorating Hot Spring. It doesn't give all of your creatures haste, only your modified creatures haste, but it has 4 +1/+1 counters that once per turn you can put on a creature. I don't need most of my creatures to have haste. I need my commander to have haste, and I need my commander to have 7 power. So this does that. Even though this looks worse than Fires of Yavimaya, it actually is better. Rhythm of the Wild is similar. Gives all your non-token creatures Riot. Well, that can be haste for Vaevicis, or if I have something else to give him haste, because haste is insanely important in this deck. We have a lot of ways of giving haste, as you can see. We've seen a bunch of them already here. If I already have, say, like, well, I guess these are bad examples because they also get +1/+1. But if I already have a way of giving him haste, like with anger or something, well, this can give him the +1/+1 counter that matters. Also, not making my creatures uncounterable is pretty important, given that we want to cast our commander and attack with him. What else gives 7 power? Okina, Temple of the Grandfathers, is actually the one card that I was like, well, I guess technically this is only here for the 7th power, but it's a land. and it doesn't really come at a cost to my mana base, really. Taps for a green tap, target legendary creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. This can target opponent stuff. It's never relevant. It's just like, we can point it at Vaevicis. Rancor is here in a similar capacity. This one is a little bit different, though, because it puts us to 8 power, which means our first attack can be for 6, and then our next two can be for 8, and that's fine. It's a little, like, it doesn't line up super, super well in that way, and it's actually on the cuttable list for that being one of the reasons. But it also returns to hand when it goes to the graveyard, which means we can sacrifice it to Vaevicis and not worry about it. There are a few cards in the deck that are like that, and we'll definitely get to that. There are sections about what we should be sacrificing. Uh, we also have well, okay, I'll talk about fight rigging. I put this card in yesterday. I haven't played with it yet. This card does seem exceptionally good for what we're trying to do, though. So it's 2 and a green enchantment, Hideaway 5. When it enters the battlefield, look at the top 5 cards of your library, exile one of them face down, and put the rest on the bottom in a random order. And at the beginning of combat on your turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Then if you control a creature with power 7 or greater, you can cast the exile card for free. Or so you can play the exile card without paying its mana cost. You can play lands off of it, too. That's why it says play. Though you need to have a land drop. Obviously, you don't want a land, but if you see 5 lands, what are you going to do? I'm pretty sure this is exceptional in this deck, but I haven't played with it yet. The idea is we can play fight rigging, hide away a card, go to combat, put a counter on Vaevicis. Hey, look, we have 7 power, which is the thing we want him to be anyway. Now we can cast the exile card, and we also don't care about fight rigging anymore, so we can sacrifice that to Vaevicis. That seems pretty good, and there are a couple other things that will be 7 power for this, or 6 power, and then we can put a counter on it. So this seems like it's really good, but I haven't tried it yet. And then we have the 2 planeswalkers. Domri, Chaosbringer, 2 red-green, 5 loyalty. The 5 loyalty is actually kind of nice because it makes it a little tough for people to get him dead, and which means like maybe we activate a couple of times. The +1 is most of why he's here. It's add a red or a green, and if it's spent to cast a creature spell, that spell gains Riot, which is either a +1/+1 counter or haste. Cool. It's exactly like Rhythm of the Wild in that way, but this makes mana, so that's neat. And it also has -3. Look at the top 4 cards of your library. You can put up to 2 creatures from among them into your hand, and the rest on the bottom in a random order. This does actually happen some amount of the time. Card advantage is a thing that sometimes we struggle with in this deck. More recently than it used to be. So I've been using it more. The reason why card advantage is more of an issue now than I used to have with in the past is my play group has changed. The play group I used to play with understood and like one had more interaction, but 2 like understood how devastating it is to let Vaevicis run rampant, and so would remove him turn after turn after turn. This is why haste is so important, because I want to cast him basically every turn and be able to attack with him that turn. I can't expect that I'll untap with my commander in play. So when I'm doing that, well, that means I'm playing fewer cards out of my hand, which means I need card advantage less. More recently, that hasn't really been happening. I've been able to like get all of my proactive stuff onto the table before I'm really interacted with, which means I sometimes need a refill, especially because if they deal with my board, I'm out of stuff. As opposed to if they keep wrathing me when it's just Vaevicis, well, I still have my hand, and Vaevicis will come back. The last Planeswalker is Sarkhan Vol. I was actually really happy with how good he is in this deck, because he has been really bad as a Planeswalker forever, but he does everything I want. 2 red-green, 4 loyalty, +1, creatures you control get +1/+1 and haste until end of turn. Hey, look at that, 7 power and haste. That's already good enough. But he has more. -2, gain control of target creature until end of turn. Untap that creature, it gains haste until end of turn. That's, if to discerning eyes, that's threaten. It's literally the card threaten. I know people call this like active treason because that's the card that's been printed a lot more recently, but I think threaten because I'm old. But it's exactly the text on this card. That is extra valuable, and there's in fact a category. We'll go to that tag next, I suppose, for threaten effects, because if I take your creature, I can use Vaevicis to sacrifice that creature from my board. Vaevicis doesn't give the permanent to it doesn't reveal the top card for the owner, it's for the controller. So that means I can get rid of multiple cards from an opponent in one attack, and get a card out of my deck, like get a free permanent from the top of my deck while I'm at it. Threatened effects are super super good, and so we'll go to that now, just because I was talking about it. And then I guess we'll do haste because I talked about that as well. The only other card with the threaten effect is Zealous Conscripts, but this can threaten any permanent, which is really nice. So that's why this is here. We don't have a lot of that because unfortunately, like creatures are the easiest thing for me to deal with, and creatures are also the things that are easiest to threaten. Zealous Conscripts is, I think, like the only one of, if it's not the only card, it's one of very few cards that can take any permanent. So I can take my opponent's enchantment and then sacrifice it to Vaevictis or whatever. I don't need more threatens for creatures, so we don't have more of those. Now we can talk about the haste stuff, since we talked about that. Haste is super important for me. I already mentioned it, and we've seen 3 of these already, or 4 of these already. We have the standards, Lightning Greaves, Swiftfoot Boots. These also have the added benefit of protecting my commander, which, as I say, people will realize that they need to get Vaevictis off the table if they want to have any proactive game plan that takes more than one turn to happen. Now, if they can do all their stuff in one turn, Vaevictis can't really deal with that. As I mentioned, interacting at instant speed is something that this deck doesn't really have access to. And, like, okay, so if they do it all in one turn, we can't really do much. But if you can't, which most decks can't, we need, the protection is kind of, like, the protection is important because they'll know that they have to deal with Vaevictis if they want to do that. Oh, we also suffer. The only ones we haven't seen are Anger, which I've mentioned. As long as it's in your graveyard and you have a mountain, your creatures have haste. One of the problems that I have with Anger is that getting it to the graveyard is not trivial. Sure, maybe it'll die in combat or whatever, but people are unlikely to block it. It is usually not the first haste effect. Normally what happens is I'll sacrifice this to Vaevictis on his first or second attack, then not have to worry about haste anymore. And like now if they blow up my haste enabler, we still saw the Anger going. But that said, like having haste isn't super good. Though if I have Anger in my graveyard, now this Rhythm of the Wild, which maybe give my commander haste, now I give my subsequent creatures +1/+1 counters since they already have haste. It's fine, but like getting it to the graveyard is kind of a hurdle. And then the last one is Hammer Battlements. This card has meld. People ask me all the time. It does not matter. So it's taps for colorless. Red tap, target creature gains haste until end of turn. Cool. Love it. I don't have Hall of the Bandit Lord, partially because it's expensive, partially because it also only makes mana by costing you 3 life, and this deck has a lot of struggles with keeping its life total high. I mentioned before that I think it's worthwhile to have some amount of life gain in your deck. Tatyova has it incidentally, so that's cool, but this deck really struggles with having it in any synergistic way. So like Hull of the Bandit Lord costing 3 life if I want to use it for literally anything is a massive cost. And then it also has 3 red. If you both own and control this and a creature named Hanweir Garrison, you can meld it in the backside as well. It doesn't matter. I don't have Hanweir Garrison. That card is not good for this deck. This is only here for the haste stuff. People sometimes ask what the backside is, and I just it doesn't matter. I'll show you the backside of the card if I have to, because I have to. But if you really want, because I have to. But it doesn't matter. All right, so that's the haste stuff going the haste, the 7 power stuff, and the threaten effects. What else do we have? Well, we'll come back to this. Some number of basic lands. You'll notice a split here between snow covered basics and non-snow covered basics, and also what the split is. Oh, there should be 2 swamps. That's what happened. Okay, there are 2 swamps in the deck, but I was like, okay, never mind. There are more green sources and black sources than red sources. Green is the primary color of this deck, then black, then red. I do want to have at least 2 basics of each type in any deck, just to make sure, like, if I need to fetch one and I drew the other one, that it's available in the deck. But the reason why we have the split is we have Field of the Dead, which we'll get to. I guess now is a good time to talk about the fodder that exists in this deck. We need to sacrifice stuff every turn to Vaevictis attack, or to every Vaevictis attack, I should say. So what are good ways of doing that? There are basically 3 categories I have for this. We have fodder generators. Field of the Dead makes 2/2s. We can just sack the tokens. Colony Garden comes with a 0/1. We can just sack that. Care Keep, a card I actually love, makes kobolds of Care Keep tokens. We can sack those. Incidentally, this is secretly a life gain card. Something that'll happen at some amount of the time is, a player has a 5/5 and they go, who should I attack? And they look over at a couple at the table and they're like, okay, that this person has a 2/2, but they're not going to block. That person has a 6/6. Okay, I won't attack into that. You're undefended. I'll attack you. But if I have Care Keep, they're like, well, you don't care about just chump blocking with your token. And the opponent with the 2/2, like, they probably don't want to just sack a creature for 5 life. So they'll probably just take the damage. I'll attack them. I just gained 5 life. Right? I would have taken 5 otherwise. And it didn't even cost me the token, though sometimes it does. So this is useful. It's a little clunky and expensive, but I like the card a lot. Also, the flavor text is great. And then Kiki Jiki Mirror Breaker also makes fodder. We can copy one of our creatures and then sack the token. That doesn't happen that much, mostly because this deck doesn't struggle for having things to sacrifice very often, which means it's often better to sacrifice something else than the token. But I can do it. I have done it before. It's just not super common, even though it is a good thing to sacrifice. Incidentally, Kiki Jiki goes infinite with Zealous Conscripts, as many of you know, right? Zealous Conscript. You tap Kiki Jiki, make a copy of the conscripts, use conscripts to untap Kiki Jiki, rinse and repeat. I have a personal opposition to infinite combos in general, but especially A plus B combos. The exception to that is Tatyova, which is my try-hard deck. I have a personal rule that this does not happen. I have done it exactly once. Someone got mad at me because, what about your rule? And then I reminded them that it was in main phase 2, and I was also conceding. So, because I think I had to go. But no, I just do not do that. I know I could. This is one of the things that constantly changes in the deck, because in the Commander League that I'll play in, there's a rule about having infinite combos available to you. They have to make it kind of broad because, like, okay, if you have the threat of an infinite combo, often that's as important as just having the infinite combo. So I've had both of these in play before, and someone was like, isn't that the thing? I was like, well, no, the first thing I did in my turn was use Kiki Jiki on something other than Zealous Conscript. But people take issues. So often I take one of these two out before I play a game in that league, which is a recipe for making mistakes when you put stuff back. But Kiki Jiki, very, very good. We also have the good fodder section of the deck. Things that I am happy to sacrifice or want to. Rancor is kind of an in-between between like just normal fodder and good fodder. It's not really getting me an advantage to sacrifice it. I'm in fact losing 2 power, but I'm not losing a card, which is, kind of a thing. Even sacrificing a 2/2 zombie is power to, like, well, I guess it's the same power toughness, but like that's a creature, it is more of a cost than we'll just put this back in my hand. In fact, for that reason, I used to have Aspect of Mongoose, a card I like a lot, but there are a bunch of problems with it. So it's kind of like Rancor in that when it goes to the graveyard, it returns to its owner's hand, and it gives the enchanted creature Shroud. But there were problems. One, the moment where it's most important for Vaevicis to have Shroud is, or the time where it's most important for him to have Shroud is in combat and on opponent's turns. So if I sacrifice it, he can be interacted with in combat before I have a chance to put it back, the aspect back on him. I can re-enchant him after combat, but that's another 2 mana to protect him on another turn. And some of the cards that give him 7 power need me to target him. That in conjunction with just being a kind of a clunky, awkward card, 2 mana to give Shroud is just not that big a deal. The card ended up getting cut, but it's a similar kind of idea with Rancor. There's also stuff but now the stuff that I like to sacrifice. Solemn Simulacrum. When it dies, I draw a card. Cool. Anger. If it's in my graveyard and I have a mountain, my creatures have haste. Neat. Green Warden Marasa. This is a big Eternal Witness that when it dies, you exile it, and it's you may exile it. Okay, I was right. It is optional, so if you don't want to, you don't have to. You may exile, and when you do, you get another regrowth. Kokusho, literally the only way of gaining life in this deck. It drains each opponent for 5 life, and you gain that much life. You don't gain 5, you gain how much they lost. Junji, the Midnight Sky. This one's kind of new. I've only played with it a little bit, and it is pretty good. It's not great, but it's not terrible. You can either make each opponent discard 2 cards and lose 2 life, or put a non-dragon creature from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control and lose 2 life. It's pretty good. It's solid. The discard 2 cards is kind of whatever. Paying 2 life is sometimes a problem, but not that big a deal. And like the bigger problem is sometimes I just don't really have anything I really care about getting back out of the graveyard. And something to remember is if I'm using this for fodder, I might sometimes be casting it the same turn that I'm sacrificing it. And so the question is it worth 5 mana to get this effect? If this card were simply sorcery, each opponent discards 2 cards and loses 2 life or whatever, like would you play this card? Maybe not, but it also comes with an extra permanent. You know, so it's pretty good. It's not acceptable. It's not as good as I thought it was going to be, which is why I'm going on and on about it. We also have Spine of Ishsaw. When it enters the battlefield, you destroy a permanent, and when it goes to the graveyard, you return it to its owner's hand. It's expensive. It's 7 mana. I don't want to be casting it over and over again, but it gives me more interaction. It gives me more removal. Remember, we're trying to interact with our opponent all the time. We haven't gotten to that part of the deck yet, but we're trying to interact with our opponent. Also, it's like nice to have a thing that costs a lot of mana to hit off of Vaevicis. It's nice to have removal to hit off of Vaevicis, and you know, eventually we can cast it again. It does. Especially in the current experience I'm having with the deck where I run out of cards some amount of the time. Well, this is if I can sacrifice it, it's another card I have, right? We also have Woodfall Primus, destroys a non-creature permanent and has persist, so it comes right back. Also with Rhythm of the Wild, Rhythm of the Wild doesn't give your creatures spells haste. It gives non-token, or sorry, I shouldn't say haste, riot. It gives your non-token creatures riot. So as this enters the battlefield, you can have it enter with a +1/+1 counter, which annihilates the -1/-1 counter for persist. Which means if you have Rhythm of the Wild, this thing comes back every time it dies, and never gets the -1/-1 counter, which is pretty cool. And the one I haven't talked about is Ugin's Nexus. This card is very silly because it was supposed to be an extra turn card. 5 mana legendary artifact. If a player would begin an extra turn, that player skips that turn instead. And like occasionally I've had that come up. I think like once ever kind of thing. But there's more text on this card, and that's why it's here. If Ugin's Nexus would be put into a graveyard from the battlefield, instead exile it and take an extra turn after this one. So we can sack it to Vaevicis and get a Time Warp. Cool, we have access to Time Warp in our Jund deck. So, and this is one of the ways, this is actually really useful as a catch-up mechanic. This deck struggles with dealing with lots of stuff because Vaevicis gets to pick out one thing at a time. A lot of my removal, you'll see, is like gets one thing. It's hard to sweep up a bunch of stuff in a way that doesn't ruin my board. But Ugin's Nexus is a really useful way of coming back. You spend a couple of turns accelerating, you get your first Vaevicis attack, next turn, play Ugin's Nexus, now you get 2 instances and like 3 Vaevicis attacks with only 1 turn of development from my opponents in between is usually enough to at least start to stabilize the board. Like mostly get it under control, take the most important parts of their engine out of the equation. I guess I should talk a little bit about... Oh, and then the last part. No, I was going to talk about ramp, but I should talk about the just general fodder. We also just have a lot of stuff we're okay with sacrificing. Once it does its thing, we don't need it to be around anymore, so we're okay with it getting sacrificed. I'm not going to go over all of these because they also exist in other categories for other reasons. But just know, like, we have a lot of stuff we're okay with sacrificing to Vaevicis. And by the way, sometimes you sack a land. It's really not the end of the world. I'd prefer not to. But especially the first attack with him, sometimes you have to sacrifice one of your lands. That's fine. Something to remember is that like you get any permanent off the top, which means sometimes you get lands from him. So sacking a land is also less important for that reason. Another thing that makes Field of the Dead good too is like, well, you're gonna get lands off the top, so it's all right. We should talk a little bit about the ramp. We have a pretty significant amount of it. Not all of it helps cast Vaevicis early, but we do want to cast him as soon as possible, ideally with haste. I generally don't like casting him if he doesn't have haste, which makes it a little more awkward than just get to 6 mana, which we could do by turn 4, but you want to get to 6 mana ideally and also have haste, which means something like Domri works into that really, really well. You can do like play a Signet on turn 2, turn 3 play Domri, turn 4 Domri makes a mana and also gives gives Vaevictis haste. This is why the tough. This is why I was saying the loyalty matters. Is on those early turns, people might have random creatures kicking around. If Domri just died, to like if Domri came in with like 2 or 3 loyalty or something and could just die before I got to untap with him, it'd be much worse. So that like the extra loyalty is valuable. Most of it is at 2 mana because like that's where a lot of it is. You notice there's no rampant growth, but there are a lot of signets and talismans and we'll be fine. Uh, but rampant growth, of course, is a sorcery, so we don't get those. Tribelder is the closest to that, but we also have like Farhaven Elf gets a land. Chromatic Lantern, I go back and forth on. It is an inefficient mana rock, right? It's 3 mana, but sometimes this deck has mana problems because I have to play a decent number of colorless lands. So this does help solve. This does solve that. It's just I don't know. I'm playing an inefficient card. I don't know. I go back and forth on it all the time. Dockside Extortionist is just an exceptional card, and I have a copy. It's perfect in this deck. It makes a bunch of mana so we can do our stuff, and then also is a thing we don't mind sacrificing. We also don't mind sacrificing the tokens, the treasure tokens to Vaevictis, but it's pretty unlikely because like, well, we already have one thing to sacrifice. We'll probably play more things to sacrifice, and I'd rather use the tokens for mana. Gilded Lotus, like Hedron Archive, is stuff like we're gonna have to cast Vaevictis a lot. We need to get to higher mana values. I could be convinced that these don't belong here. Mostly the Hedron Archive, but also card draw is hard to get, and this says draw 2 cards. 6 mana, draw 2, kind of sucks, but we're Jund, and we also don't get instants and sorcery, so drawing is tough. It's actually really difficult. In fact, most of the card advantage of the deck doesn't draw cards. So this is like it puts cards in our hand, I guess. It's not the best, but it's there. We also have Temple of the False God. It's more of a trap in this deck than in other ones, but like we're trying to get to that many lands. The bigger problem is if we find it in the early turns, it might not do what we need to. But if we have a draw where it's something like Tribelder into Solemn, Temple of the False God is a piece of acceleration to cast Vaevictis as well. Even if we're just casting him off of 5 lands, right? Maybe we play like uh, Tribelder and or how do I get 5 lands into play? I guess maybe not 2 turns early. Maybe we only accelerate once, and it's with Tribelder. This is a 6th mana. Like the fact that we're trying to get to 6 and this goes from 4 to 6 is helpful. What else is also here in the Farhaven Elf vein of just like it gets a land, it fixes us, and also is random junk we can sacrifice. The Great Henge is more of a payoff than acceleration. As a note, Vaevictis has 6 power, so this costs 3 if he's in play. If we ever get to 7 power, which we're trying to do anyway, this costs 2, which is really nice. It also draws cards, which is exceptional. It's also a big payoff thing to hit with Vaevictis. That's another thing we want some amount of good stuff to flip into, so that's here. And then the things I haven't talked about are Worn Power Stone and Coalition Relic. I think I have historically overvalued Coalition Relic. This card is a lot less good than I thought it was. But in this deck in particular, it does something really important, which is that Coalition Relic and Worn Power Stone cost 3 mana to make 2, which means let's say we don't have a 2 mana accelerant, we can play our 3 mana accelerant and still on turn 4 cast our commander. Going 3 into 6 is pretty big. So that's the ramp part of the deck. Now I guess let's talk about the big things, the things that we really want to hit. I've had a few versions of like kind of things I had to hit, like to hit. I kind of want more, but it's awkward because they're not always on top of your deck. Like library manipulation is available and we have some of it, but not infinite amounts. We can't manipulate anything we want. So they do need to be like a little bit castable. And what kinds of things they are also matters. When I say what kinds of things they are, is I used to have captive audience. First of all, the thing I don't like about this is that it really only makes one person's life miserable as opposed to affecting all of my opponents. And then the second part is what it does is not that important. So enters the battlefield under the control of an opponent of your choice. At the beginning of your upkeep, choose one that hasn't been chosen. Your life total becomes 4. This is usually the first one, and a lot of people can play from a huge amount of the time. Someone can play from 4 life and have it not be that big a deal. So that's the other thing to remember is like it might make their life total 4, then get removed, and like is that really worth this 7 mana enchantment? Even if I didn't pay for it, I might have like set it up on the top of my deck. Is that really worthwhile? Like this. Oh, sorry. This is not usually the first one. The first one is each opponent creates 5/2/2 black zombie creature tokens. Now, because everyone but the enchanted, but like the person who controls this gets the tokens, it means that these zombies are only useful for attacking the player with captive audience. But if you do that, then the 2 other people with 10 power and zombies can attack you, and you don't have the blockers. So these end up just being 5 blockers that I give to my other opponents. Also, this deck struggles a lot with dealing with swarms of things. So, giving 2 of my opponents a swarm of zombies that I don't really make that much use out of is not great. And, like, discard your hand, your life total becomes 4 are bad, but they are survivable. If this, like, really, really made an opponent lose the game, maybe I'd think about it. But it's combined with it also makes things more difficult for me is why this card got cut. I used to have cards like this, or I used to have this card exactly, and sometimes cards like this are things that I'll consider, but I'm usually off of. What they do is really important. It can't just be some big devastating card. It needs to, the way it's devastating is important. So that said, what are our big things? They're all some degree of castable, right? The biggest one is 8 mana. It's not like I'm putting Ulamogs into play here. That said, we're trying to cast Vaevicis every turn through a commander tax, so like we can cast big stuff. I just don't want to have my hand clogged with massive things. But what do? Itali is phenomenal card advantage. This is a must answer. If you've played with it, if you've ever seen this card in a game, you're aware of how good it is. Green Warden is the weakest. I just put it here because it is 6 mana and like, we get stuff out of it. It is 2 cards back. It's fine. Massacre Worm and Scourge of Care Ridges are here to answer the exact thing I just mentioned when talking about captive audience. I have difficulty dealing with swarms of things. Massacre Worm, 3 triple black, so a little tough to cast, but it's doable. And when it enters the battlefield, creatures your opponents control get -2/-2 until end of turn. If it said creatures target player controls or target opponent controls get -2 and -2 until end of turn, I probably wouldn't play it. Like, make clear how important it is that it's everyone. And when a creature an opponent controls is put into the graveyard for the battlefield, that player loses 2 life. That's neat and incidental. That's not why it's here. It's here for the come into play effect. So it's also something I'll sometimes sacrifice to Vaevicis. I forgot to actually put that in the fodder pile. Because, like, I don't... It's one of the last things I want to sacrifice, but I am okay with sacrificing it, because once it's in play, it's not that big a deal. And getting it back from the graveyard, a thing we can do very, very well, is more valuable than its static ability. Scourge of Care Ridges is easily the weirdest one. People have like been confused about this one, but it's just that important to be able to sweep a bunch of stuff. I also just happen to love this card. 6 red, 6/6 flying, and it has Rough Tumble on the card. If you're not familiar with Rough Tumble, it is a split card that has 1 and a red, deal 2 damage to each creature with flying or without flying. And the other side of the split card is 5 and a red, deal 6 damage to each creature with flying. Now it says each other, so it doesn't kill itself. And we don't often use that 6 mana ability, but the 2 mana ability is really good, and some number of my creatures, like a lot of the creatures I care about, don't die to 2 activations either, which lets us clean up a lot of the board. Vaevictis also flies, and he's the most important thing. So if I want to activate this 3 times, 4 times in a turn, and I need to, he's not going to die, even if my like Massacre Worm dies. We have Sepulchral Primordial. This one's just like a little like cutesy. It might not be the best, but it's here. 5 black, 5/4 Intimidate. When it enters the battlefield, for each opponent, put a creature from their graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. It's just good card advantage, and I am putting creatures into their graveyards with Vaevictis. Often they're best creatures. It's just that creatures or like cards in your opponent's deck are usually going to synergize with their deck and not yours. So they're not. It's not like that big that we're getting these good creatures from their graveyard. It might not do anything for me specifically. We talked about Spine of Ishsaw. Terastodon is like the staple for this deck. Enters the battlefield, destroy up to 3 non-creature permanents. You can choose your own, by the way, and up to 3 is a pretty big deal. And then for each one, its controller makes a 3/3. The 3/3s weirdly don't... shouldn't say weirdly. I would expect them to matter in the, I can't deal with swarms of things sense, kind of in the way the captive audience one does. But the fact that it's only 3 of them makes it pretty manageable. Obviously, anyone who's played with Terraston is aware that the threes are very much not adequate compensation for what just happened. I just expected this deck to care more about them than it ended up doing. Talked about the Great Henge. Oh, this also gains life, so I guess Kokusho isn't the only way. And it is nice that it does. It just doesn't gain that much, so like, but it's it doesn't come at any cost. If this didn't have the gain 2 life part of it, I would still play this card. And we talked about what Fall Prime is. Let's talk a little. Let's talk about the removal part of the deck, which I haven't talked about yet, which is funny given that I started off by saying this deck is, hey, interact with your opponent all the time. We have a lot of removal. Acidic Slime blows up an artifact, enchantment, or land. Usually not land, but if someone has a Cabal Coffers or something. All right. Big Game Hunter kills a creature with power 4 or greater. Now, you might have noticed that at the top of here, Big Game Hunter is in a category by itself, and that category is the Heart category. I love this card. I love it so much. Years ago, I built a Carador deck, and at the time, a friend was like, I was going to put this card in, and a friend was like, is that card actually good? Sorry, I'm like fiddling with the thing I'm about to show you. Is that card actually good? And I was like, no, I'm pretty sure this card is really, really good. It has Madness for a black, by the way. It doesn't matter. And so I started keeping tallies on my copy of the card. I hope you can see it. Let me open up the OBS. Let me see. I started keeping tallies on my copy of the card for each kill it got, and now it's like, it's kind of like the Big Game Hunter is tracking its kills. My friend has acknowledged, I was talking to him yesterday actually, he was like, I have very much been proven wrong about this. I was a long time ago, but he does think it's really funny that I keep doing it. Card's pretty good. Kills a thing, and then like is a body that sticks around for us to sacrifice later. We have a lot of versions of this card, Concrete Naturalist. Oh, I shouldn't say it's the worst, but it is like the Reclamation Sage is the best version of that. Then we have Indrik, Stomp Howler, and Conclave Naturalist that do the same thing. Rec Sage is a 3 mana 2/1. These two are 5 mana 4/4s. The 4/4 part doesn't really matter that much, but its interaction, it deals with artifacts and enchantments. Cool. We have a bunch of these Fleshbag Marauder type effects. We have Fleshbag Marauder, Merciless Executioner, and Plague Crafter. They all are 3 power, not that that much matters. When it enters the battlefield, each player sacks a creature. By the way, people are very some amount of the time, people's first creature will be their commander, because that's the thing they're building their deck around. That's the thing they're playing to. So like there will be turns where people, like 2 or 3 people play their commander, and I cast a Fleshbag Marauder and set everyone back massively. It's pretty important. It's pretty cool. These 2 are 3/1s. This one's a 3/2. Also, Plague Crafter lets them sack a Planeswalker instead, and also if they can't sack a thing, they discard a card. So you're always getting a card from an opponent. That doesn't make it the best one. And it can force them to sack a Planeswalker. It's not, but only if they have no creatures and they do have a Planeswalker. Incidentally, Planeswalkers are kind of funny with Vaevicis because you can attack the Planeswalker and then target another thing, and so they lose 2 permanents, or you can just target their Planeswalker and get it off the table if you're not sure you can get through. Oh, that's also really important to note, and I haven't mentioned it yet. Combat for this deck is actually really complicated because you spend a lot of time doing the Vaevictis stuff. You kind of forget about actual combat mechanics of attacks. Then you go to blocks. After you do Vaevictis stuff and you do all the triggers, then you go to blocks, which also means that people will be like, people sometimes are like, oh, I guess I'm just dead to Vaevictis because I have no creatures and it's at lethal damage. And I have to remind them, no, I don't have a choice about his trigger. I have to target something of yours, and if you flip a flyer, you can block. It doesn't happen a lot, but it does sometimes happen. This is also why I've sometimes had people ask to borrow my decks to play against me. This deck gets obliterated by Mael because it's constantly flipping massive stuff. And that's also why I have so much removal, by the way, is I want to deal with the thing that Vaevictis lets them flip into. So what Vaevictis lets me do is take their most important card and turn it into something random, and then I want the follow-up to be get rid of the next most important thing, especially if the random thing you flipped was really important. So that's also why a lot of these are here. I think I didn't explain that aspect of the deck. So we have Raven's Chupacabra in this for that reason, destroys a creature. Shriekmaw destroys a non-black, non-artifact creature, which can sometimes be annoying. I almost never evoke it because I like the fodder, but I can if I want to. It's a 3/2 fear, which doesn't really much matter. It's just like this kills a creature when it enters and sticks around. I could play like Bone Shredder, I think is the card, which is a 3 mana version of this, but I don't want to pay the Echo, which I might need to keep it around long enough to sacrifice. There's a lot to it. We talked about Spine, we talked about Terrastodon, talked about Wolf House. We also have the Eldest Reborn. 4 and a black. This mostly went in the deck because sagas were new, and I was like, I wonder if there are any good sagas for this. It's probably good enough, but I'm a little on the fence about it. I think it's currently in the cuttable pile. 4 and a black saga. The first chapter is each opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker. Cool, we have a lot of that. And remember, sacrifice is like one of the reasons we suck at dealing with swarms. If people have a bunch of random stuff, they can just throw it away to the sacrifice. But also, Vaevictis should be like reducing the amount of stuff they have. So sacrifice is a lot closer to targeted removal than it looks like. Just in like, well, if I if I Vaevictis your stuff down to you having only one creature, then the sacrifice cleans up the rest of your stuff. You know. Then the second one is each opponent discards a card. That's not super relevant, but sure, I guess I get a little bit of card advantage. And then the last chapter is put a creature or planeswalker card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. So you can get your opponent's stuff too. The one thing that's a little unfortunate is I kind of wish that we could sacrifice it. We would sacrifice this to Vaevictis like after we got the most important trigger on the last one, but we can't. That might sound like obvious and weird, but some sagas you only really care about the first chapter or two, at which point you can just sacrifice it to Vaevictis, who cares? But the best chapters on this are 1 and 3. So we don't often get to sacrifice it to Vaevictis, which, if we could, would be nice. We also have a little bit of interaction that didn't land here in the removal pile, but is still interaction, which is this stuff here. I guess we talked about most of it, because like Playcrafter discards a card, Eldest Reborn discards a card, Junji can discard cards. There's also Bojuka Bog, which can hit graveyards. It's kind of free to play. There's also Recursion. We talked about Green Ward and Marasa, but we also have Eternal Witness to get stuff back. Junji can get things back. Eldest Reborn. Oh, actually, there's a card that should be in the Recursion pile and isn't. But then there's a couple of cards that synergize a little bit differently. Volrath Stronghold is one of those cards that I was thinking about when I was talking about getting Massacre Worm back. Because we have some of this recursion, but like Volrath Stronghold and Haunted Crossroads are much better at getting those things back. Both of them, in some way or other, or both of them allow you to put a creature from your graveyard on top of your library. Haunted Crossroads just costs you a black to do it. Volrath Stronghold, because it's a land, and like you don't, instead of casting your spell, it's going to be less efficient. It's 1 to black tap, put a creature from a graveyard on top. This has been an issue for my opponents to deal with in the past, where I'm like, okay, you have to deal with Atali, but once you do, he's going to keep coming back. And remember, Vaevictis puts the top card into play and doesn't shuffle. So this can let us set up a big thing to be on the top of the library. And in fact, the next thing we're going to talk about is our ability to control the top of our library, because that is something that is valuable when we do it. I used to go so deep as to play like Crystal Ball, I think is the card. It's like 3 mana artifact, 1 tap, scry 2. We're not going that deep on it. It's not worth it. But we have some amount of ways to control the top of our library, and this is how we can do it in a way that's also recursive and gives us a little bit more control. Like if I know I need Chupacabra, for example, I know I need to kill a creature, I can put that on top. Or if I know I need to destroy an artifact or enchantment, I can put something that does that on top. If those aren't important to me, maybe I can put like a Tali, you have the selection of what you've already found. And the last one is Journey to Eternity. I love this card. It is so good in this deck, largely because you deal with a lot of the risk of this card immediately in part of the game plan. So this is 1 black green, enchant creature you control. It's a legendary enchantment. I always forget about that, but it's not super relevant. When enchanted creature dies, return it to the battlefield under your control, then return Journey to Eternity to the battlefield transformed under your control. The big risk of this card is like if they just blow up the enchantment, or if they get rid of the creature without it dying, this does nothing, and you get 2 for 1 and all this other stuff. But with Vaevictis, I can put this on a creature, attack with Vaevictis, and sacrifice that creature to the journey. It returns to it returns to the battlefield under your control. So if I ever threaten someone's creature, I can also use this to like keep it. That has not happened yet, but it's important to note, I suppose. This gets us our come into play triggers again, our death triggers, like putting on Junji, putting on Eternal Witness. We get a lot of value out of this. We're junding them out. We're getting incremental advantage while also disrupting our opponent constantly. Even getting back Solemn Simulacrum is a land and a card. And then the backside of this is also great. It's a land that taps for mana of any color, which is not irrelevant. Some of these tap for colorless, and the fact this is any color is phenomenal. And it's not just green-black either. It can make red if I need it to. And it has 3 green-black tap. Return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It's phenomenal. We already want, like, that's already access to a mechanism of card advantage that we kind of want because we don't have a lot of ways of getting card advantage. But now we sack a thing. Now we can get it back. We can keep rebuying threats. It's very, very good in the grindy games. It has become less important recently because people just haven't been interacting with my board in the same way. It's just really strange. In the same way that I was saying I empty my hand a lot, is people aren't dealing with my board as much. And so this card gets worse, but I mean, it's still like the floor on this is it's a manolith, I guess. That also gets you come to play and death triggers on a creature. It's fine. I actually top deck control. That was the thing we were about to talk about. Yeah, we have utility because I don't know what else to put here. So we have a few cards that help us control the top of our library. We already talked about Haunted Crossroads and Vorwas Stronghold. I also have Scroll Rack, a card. So Scroll Rack and Sensei's Divining Top are cards that I sometimes will. Oh, it's been a while since I've heard people say it, but I used to hear people say all the time. It's just like a staple. It should go into every commander deck. I don't think that's true, but this deck makes distinct use of them. Sensei's Divining Top, we can rearrange the top 3 cards of our library to get a permanent into play. And if we want none of them, let's say they're all situational things that we want later, we can just draw with the top, put that card in our hand for when we need it, and put the top into play with Vaevictis. Obviously, the top is much worse than anything in our deck we would put into play, except for maybe a land. But no, it's worse than a land. But like I said, what if there are 3 Plague Crafter type effects on top and my opponents have no creatures? I might as well hold on to it. The fact that it's there is nice. Being able to do that is also a reason why you can, like, all these 3 cards in particular, Scroll Rack, Sensei's Divining Top, and Sylvan Library, are the reasons why you could get away with playing some number of instants and sorceries. I've just seen I've seen one other person with this deck that had instants and sorceries, and they kept accidentally hurting their own board when attacking with Vaevictis. Like, if you just don't have these, like you're swinging wild, so you probably still don't want a lot of instants and sorceries, even if you don't go mono permanents. There's Scroll Rack, which is awesome in this deck, but we need more shuffles, I think, to make it really, really good. We talked about this with Tatyova. Actually, Scroll Rack is in 3 of my decks, which is really funny because I don't think it's a staple, but it happens to synergize in those decks. Though I was just talking about how Tatyova maybe could do without it. You can put any number of cards in your hand on top of your library, put them aside, take that many cards from the top of your library, put them in your hand, and then put those cards on top in any order. This also means that if we have like a Farhaven Elf or a Wood Elves, we can get a new hand entirely. If you're struggling for, like, you need one more land, you can use this to, like, dig X cards deeper. It's not at its best in this deck because we really need ways of getting a lot of cards in our hand, which is why I've been noticing that it's been a problem for this deck, because I've had Scroll Rack and just not a lot of cards because I played my hand and realized, like, oh, this card gets a lot worse if you don't have a way of refilling your hand. It's still really good, but, necessary caveats. Sylvan Library is great, though. 1 green enchantment. In your draw step, you draw 2 extra cards, and then if you do, choose 2 cards in your hand that you drew this turn for each and you can either pay for life or put that card on top of your library for each card. I don't often draw extra cards with this just because my life total is so precarious in this deck. This deck, more than any of my others, makes me realize how much of a burden it can be if you just randomly get knocked down to 17 early and you don't have any way of of buffering your life total. Now for the rest of the game, you're like, well, can I afford to pay 4 to a Sylvan Library? Like, someone extorts you once, and that's a huge deal. Like, now you have to really worry about blockers. This is why having some amount of life game is important, and like my Sylvan Library quality suffers because I don't have access to a lot of it. It's just hard to find good access to it. But we have a lot of good ways of setting up the top of our library. The thing that Scroll Rack does that the other two don't, by the way, since I mentioned all its like caveats, is that it lets you put cards from your hand on top. If you just draw the Scourge of Carriages, I mean, obviously you'd rather not cast it. Well, now it can be your top card, where these two can't really do that. They can float cards on top for a long time, but if it's already in your hand, they can't do anything about that. And this is also what I meant about not having infinite access to library manipulation in the way we want it. Once a card is in our hand, only Scroll Rack puts it on top unless we cast it first, right? With so like Haunted Crossroads and Volrath Stronghold, sure, can put my Scourge of Carriages on top if it's in my graveyard, but how are we getting there other than casting it first? Scroll Rack can do that, the other two can't, which means our big things, that's what I was saying about we need to be kind of careful. We can't we can't just put like Eldrazi in our deck and be like, it's fine if I draw it, I'll put it on top. We don't have a lot of access to that. In blue, maybe we would, but then you'd also have to probably be playing like non-permanent cards like Brainstorm. Though I guess Jace the Mind Sculptor, if I got to play it, would be really really good in this deck. Actually, Jace the Mind Sculptor would be insane in this deck. Obviously, I can't play it though. All right, there's definitely stuff I've missed. But I'm not sure what it was. Card advantage. Okay, this section is really important. Let me just make sure I haven't skipped anything else. Oh yeah, here's my heart category. And I guess I should mention these anti-Shroud cards. Shroud and Hexproof are massive problems for this deck. Lightning Greaves and Swiftfoot Boots mean that it takes me 2 Vaevictis attacks to kill an important creature, and sometimes that's all someone needs to really go off with that thing. So Arcane Lighthouse and Detection Tower, kind of like in Hilda, are kind of necessary as a means of getting around that problem. Now, these don't deal with ward, which more and more is showing up, and there are some ward costs that are prohibitively expensive. I think there's a Sauron that's like its ward is discard an instant, sorcery, or legendary card. And it's like, well, we don't have any instants and sorceries, and we don't have tons of legends, and I'd rather not discard them, you know? So that's just a difficult card for us to deal with. But before the like prevalence of ward, there were a lot of cards with Shroud or Hexproof. Obviously, Arcane Lighthouse is the better of the two. It deals with both Shroud and Hexproof, whereas Detection Tower only deals with Hexproof. It's just strictly worse, basically. I guess. No, yeah, I guess it is. I was gonna say it did one thing that the other one doesn't, but no, it doesn't. Yeah, it does the same thing. So Arcane Lighthouse is obviously better, but you just need more of this effect, and you don't always have access to whichever one you want. And this helps get around the Lightning Greaves problem. Obviously, if we have, that's also why I have so many disenchant creatures. Wait, what the hell is this? Oh, this is in the cuttable section. This is why I have so many disenchant creatures. Is getting rid of artifacts or enchantments is massively important. Like I can't Fleshbag Marauder their enchantment, but I can Conclave Naturalist it, and maybe I need to destroy Lightning Greaves so that Vaevictis can deal with the thing. All right, now we can talk about card advantage in this deck because there's some cool stuff in here. We talked about a lot of it. Etalia's card advantage, Domri's card advantage, Haunted Crossroads. It doesn't really look like it, but it kind of is because we can put important things that give us cards on top. I don't know. It's only quasi card advantage because it doesn't put it in our hand, but it is kind of like Fight Rigging, Journey to Eternity we talked about. Sepulchral Primordial is kind of card advantage. It's just from our opponents. Sylvan Library also kind of card advantage because I don't have the freedom to pay for life as much as I'd like. The Great Hinge is like obviously tons and tons and tons of card advantage. This also doesn't need you to cast a creature to draw cards. Whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, it gets a 1/1 counter and draws a card. Also, that 1/1 counter, if we get this into play and Vaevictis dies, gets Vaevictis up to 7 power. I forgot to put this in the 7 power enabler thing. It doesn't feel like it should be because we probably need Vaevictis in play to cast the Great Henge or to get the Great Henge onto the battlefield. But even if that's true, Vaevictis dies a lot. and if he's not dying, well, our opponents are probably losing. So the fact that this doesn't get it to 7 power isn't the end of the world. But he does die a lot, which means getting him, casting him, and having him, letting him have 7 power is off of this is useful. We also have a couple of cards that maybe they're not maybe they don't need to be here anymore. Spinerock Knoll in particular got a lot better because of the increase of 7 power enablers, but they're both. Well, we'll talk about what they do and then we'll talk about the problems. So both of them enter the battlefield tapped. Hideaway, if it just says Hideaway, entering tapped is part of the text of Hideaway. So even though it doesn't say it on the card, it enters tapped, which is also why that one creature with Hideaway, whose name I forgot, enters tapped, even though it doesn't say it on the card. It's because Hideaway says so. You look at the top 4, exile one of them face down, and the card will let you cast it in some way. So Spinerock Knoll taps for green, Mosswort Bridge taps for Spinerock Knoll taps for red, Mosswort Bridge taps for green. The Knoll is red tap. You can play the exiled card without paying its mana cost if an opponent was dealt 7 or more damage this turn. This used to be the easier of the two to have happen because you don't need to deal the 7 damage. It just doesn't work out that way. It's actually kind of tough and a little unreliable. That said, Vaevictis does deal 7 damage more frequently now than he used to, so there's that. I think given like mana problems, the color problems this deck has been having, maybe both of these Hideaway lands should just be more color fixing lands. That said, they're also kind of fodder in the sense that like once they cast their Hideaway spells, this is basically just a mountain, right? This is basically just a forest. And then Mosswort Bridge is the same thing. The only difference is that in order to play the exiled card, you have to have 10 total power on your board. This is actually kind of awkward. There are a decent number of 3-power creatures in the deck, but Vaevictis is 6, so like that's even if I play Fleshbag Marauder with Vaevictis in play, and I want to respond to the triggered ability of the Fleshbag Marauder, I only have 9 power. There are also a lot of 2-power creatures in the deck, so if Vaevictis is 7 and then I play my Eternal Witness, that's still not 10. Also, people should be trying to get rid of Vaevictis. So this is, yeah, I think I've talked myself out of both of these cards just through saying that, but it is a land that gets you a card, which is hard to argue with. So there's that. And then there's Death Reap Ritual, 2 black green enchantment. At the beginning of each end step, if a creature died this turn, draw a card. This is each end step, which is really nice. If things die on opponent's turns, which they do often, here are cards. This is one of the best card draw engines in the deck, even though it's sometimes inconsistent and like, you gotta have some stuff going. But even if you Chupacabra an opponent's creature, if you Fleshbag Marauder, that's things dying. I know there's another version of this where it's like, I think it's 5 mana, and it's whenever a creature you control dies, gain a life, draw a card. Maybe that card is good. Maybe it's worthwhile. I wouldn't replace Death Reap Ritual for it. With it, I might play it in addition to Death Reap Ritual. But it's just one of those, my creatures die 1 a turn, usually. So it's not much different than the Death Reap Ritual, except for when my opponents are removing my stuff, which I guess does happen, and they should be doing. So maybe it's worthwhile to play that as well. And then Aid from the Cowl is a card that it's on EDH Rec, but I definitely discovered this on my own and was so proud of myself when I did. This card is actually mega bonkers in this deck, which is hilarious because it's terrible in most decks. What is this card? 3 green enchantment, Revolt. At the beginning of your end step, so this is only your end step, notably, but it's powerful enough where that makes sense. If a permanent you control left the battle this turn, so that could be bounced, exiled, not phased out, but sacrificed. It doesn't have to die. It just needs to leave the battlefield. Most of the time in our deck, we're sacrificing a thing. But it's also any permanent. It doesn't care if it's a creature. It's as long as it left the battlefield. Reveal the top card of your library. If it's a permanent card, you put it on the battlefield. Otherwise, you may put it on the bottom. We're all permanents. This always gets a card. If we have Aid from the Cowl, basically every turn we're getting a free card off of the top. Is not always, maybe if Vaevictis is dealt with, maybe I don't have a fetch land or whatever else, we'll get one of my things off the table. But especially with Vaevictis, it basically means Vaevictis gets 2 cards off the top. It's super good card advantage. It's also mana advantage since it puts it directly into play. We have limited control over what's on top, so it's not always exactly what we want. And frequently, just like Vaevictis and this often just hit lands, but that's fine. That also helps us cast more stuff later. Super strong card. I'm probably overselling it, but I just love that this otherwise terrible card is an all-star in this deck. All right. We talked about our cuttable stuff. We also have our fixing. Most of these are lands. Something to note about the lands in this deck is that we have a lot of lands that are like a little subpar, but we're also trying to enable Field of the Dead. I could cut like Rivetier's Outlook, Evolving Wilds, Terramorphic Expanse, and I think I probably, but like they work so well with what's it called, Field of the Dead. Maybe I'll leave in the Rivetier's Outlook. We'll put the other two in cuttable. I hate that I'm cutting these because like I don't know, they've for so long been justifiable. I know more and more you can't really afford to have lands come into play tapped, but now they're like the only ones left that do, and so like you can get away with one or two, except when it comes to, well, you can upgrade it, they're the worst ones. So we'll try to find more. I know there are some cycles that I haven't completed. I like Undergrowth Stadium, I think is the name of the card that completes the Spire Garden cycle, the ally color version of these. I need that for this deck. The green black lands are usually better the than any red land, and I have even splits. Again, I haven't put active effort in this deck for a while, and I haven't. This is the first it's been on some deck building website where I can really look like how many red sources do I have as compared to red cards, and how many green pips do I have? Do I need more green source or whatever? Um, I probably should put in more. Like I definitely need more green black fixing. But that's mostly because like the battle bond lands were only ally colors. We can put in some more, but I have to keep an eye towards also the fact that Field of the Dead is in my deck. I can't just put in a ton of basics, even though I like basic lands generally. And we have kind of stringent mana requirements sometimes. It doesn't look like it in the way I've gone over the deck, but yeah, there's like we're trying to cast spells that cost triple green, triple black, double red at the most extreme, and one of the double red cards wants a lot of red paid into it with Scourge of Carriages. Um, Plus, we have a bunch of colorless lands in Arcane Lighthouse, Detection Tower, Field of the Dead, so on. Oh, excuse me. But also, Field of the Dead coming in tapped is another reason why, like, well, maybe fewer tap land. That's one more tap land in our deck. And also, we're a little light on lands in this deck. This deck has 37. Maybe I should play one more. But since I'm currently not, fetching in the early turns is sometimes like, oh, I'm not going to hit land 5 or 6 to cast Vaevictis. I almost certainly need at least one more land in this deck. All right, we talked about the fodder. I think all of them came up in other regards as well. The fodder makers, the good fodder, the haste outlets, the haste enablers, interaction. By the way, sometimes I'll have multiple instances of haste on my board, and it puts kind of an interesting question like puts me kind of to a test that I don't know is interesting and difficult in a game to game basis. Basically, like let's say we have I don't know Rising of the Day and Invigorating Hot Spring. You're like, well, I don't need haste twice, and one of them is better in the situation than the other. Maybe Vaevictis already has 7 power, so Rising of the Day isn't super important. I don't care about it giving any of my other creatures +1/+0, by the way. So like maybe the extra 1/1 counters from this will be nice, and we can modify a creature with Rancor or something. Whatever. Maybe we want to sacrifice one of them. But then because you have double haste already. But then if someone destroys the other one or removes it in some other way, now you have no haste outlets. So that's something that comes up a lot. Of like having double haste is more than you want, but getting rid of one of them is risky because an opponent might get rid of the other one. This is another reason why Anger is good, because this can just sit in my graveyard, and if I do have 2 haste outlet enablers, I can still sack one, and if the other one gets destroyed, I still have Anger as the backup. Or I could even, if I have Anger plus, maybe Handware Battlements, which is another colorless land, by the way. I can sack the Battlements because it's not good for my mana, and I don't need haste anyway, and not have to worry that I won't have haste going forward. Now, people can interact with my graveyard. It's just much less common than interacting with your board. Talked about this stuff. Talked about all this. Our acceleration. our recursion, our removal. We talked about all of that. Yeah, here are two sweepers, as I mentioned. Swarms are a problem. This is all the only access that we really have to it. Maybe there's some other stuff that I haven't noticed. One of the big problems I've had with this deck when I try to update it is that, I often, like a lot of people, will go to EDH Rec for ideas, but people have very different ideas, especially on this deck more than my other ones, about what you should be doing. There's not I don't think most people are on mono permanence, which makes a lot of the decisions on what cards are good or bad very different. People might not have to go to a card, like might not have to go to Scourge of Care Regis. You don't have to go that deep if you have access to like Chain Reaction, for example. But I don't, so I do have to go this deep. And then some cards, that would be really good and our permanents in this deck won't be that good if you're playing instants and sorcery. Like Aid from the Cowl is much worse if you aren't mono permanents, which is why it wasn't on EDH Rec for a while, by the way. So it makes it really tough to find new cards because I have to do a lot of the work myself, and it's hard to find cards like if you don't know a card exists, it's hard to know and figure out that it exists. So Magic Thesauruses are like a Magic Thesaurus is something that I've thought for a while would be really useful. I've seen one online. It's just not very good, and I just don't know how you would make it. It's pretty tough. So that's the totality of what's in the deck. Now let's talk about like what I'm considering at the moment. Helm of the Host used to be in the deck. I have no idea what happened to my copy of it. Maybe it was too much mana and I cut it. I don't know what happened. I don't know where my copy of this card even went, but it used to be in here. It works really interestingly with Vaevicis. So it's 4 mana equipment, 5 to equip. At the beginning of combat on your turn, create a token that's a copy of the equipped creature, except the token isn't legendary and the token gains haste. You don't have to sacrifice the token at the end step either. So having additional Vaevictis triggers is out of this. Like your opponents can't let you do that. Like my opponents, if they ever let me do that, they're probably getting buried and never clawing out of the pit. And this is also what I meant about having multiple Vaevictis triggers with the same card on top. If I have Helm of the Host or Ugin's Nexus is the other way I was thinking, I can get multiple Vaevictis triggers before you've had a turn to draw your card. So if you flip Spell Pierce or something, or some instant or sorcery, I just get to eat like 3 permanents if I can get multiple attacks, right? So this card is really good. I really don't know what happened to my copy. I'll try to find it and put it back in. Ichor Wellspring is a card that used to be in the deck. This is like a good fodder type thing. It does draw cards. It's kind of a 2 mana divination. 2 mana artifact. When it enters the battlefield or is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, draw a card. So you play it, draws a card, sack it to Vaevicis, draw a card. Cool. It also occasionally, depending on what your acceleration is in a given game, can be played before Vaevictis, and you're happy to sacrifice it. That's one of the things that's difficult is ideally you want to play Vaevictis early with haste and a thing you're happy to sacrifice. There are draws with Ichor Wellspring where you could do that. They almost all need Soul Ring. But that could be good. So this is something that's on the fence. I just need a copy of Portal of Phyrexia. There's no question that this card needs to be in this deck. It does everything I want. It's big, so I'm cool to put it into play. It's moderately castable, so if I draw it, maybe I can get it into play. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices their creatures. Cool. It deals with a lot of stuff. It's interaction, it's removal. That's already what we're trying to do. That's fantastic. It doesn't deal with massive swarms, but if people are developing like a moderate board, it deals with a lot of that at once. Phenomenal. And at the beginning of your upkeep, put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. It's a recursion in addition to its other types. So it's also recursion for the things I'm sacrificing and I want to come into play and leave play anyway. 10 out of 10 card. There's no way this card isn't exceptional in this deck. I just need to get a copy. That's how it is for a lot of the cards that are in considering in any of my decks, by the way. This one more than most. Italia, Primal Conqueror. When it enters the battlefield, you get the top spell from each player's deck, and you get to cast it. That's great. It's card advantage. It's less consistent than the other Atali, but it's still really, really good. We're probably never going to flip it, but that's fine. It's also good entering and leaving the battlefield. So that's something to consider. Of like, we can sack it to Vaevictis, put it back on top with Haunted Crossroads, things like that. So definitely need a copy for this deck. It's a great big thing to put in. It gets to the point where if we have enough actually big things to put in, we can cut stuff like Sepulchral Primordial, which is it's fine. It's not as good as it used to be. Kodama of the Eastery, this is another one. I just need a copy. I need this for like 3 of my decks, and I only have one at the moment. We talked about it in Tatyova. It's very similar here. If Vaevicis puts a big thing into play, we can put another thing. It's likely to be significantly worse in this deck than it would be in any of my other ones where I want it. This is going to be the last deck that would get it if it gets it at all. Part of the problem is if we get a land off of Vaevictis, we might not have a land to put it in. I also was just talking about at length throughout this whole deck tech how having cards in hand is more and more becoming an issue. So if we don't have cards, then it doesn't help that much. But it's something I'm thinking about. Overseer of the Damned is another one where like it might not actually be good, but I'm considering it as another big thing to have. 5 black, 5/5 flying. When it enters the battlefield, destroy target creature. So cool. It's a big chupacabra. That's really nice to flip off of Vaevictis, but much worse when we draw it. And that's kind of a balance that we need to strike. Is we need to like most of our stuff we're gonna cast, but we also want enough things to cheat in off the top that we can get paid out sometimes. It makes me think I do need more library manipulation, but I don't want to go so deep as to play Crystal Ball again. I need something that does it effectively. Maybe like Miri's Guile is worthwhile, especially if we're not drawing extra cards with Sylvan Library. It's basically the same thing. It's just during your upkeep, you look at the top 3 cards at the beginning of your upkeep, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put them back in any order. It's one Sensei's Divining Top trigger, which if we have the top, we can sacrifice this. That's probably fine. Yeah, this actually seems really good. And like if you don't draw extra cards with Sylvan Library, it basically is just Miri's Guile. It's only the only real difference is you can pay for a life to draw extra cards with Sylvan Library, which don't get me wrong, that's really important. That's the reason why Sylvan Library is played in a lot of stuff and Miri's Guile isn't. But if we don't draw the cards out often, and like we don't really, and we need the library manipulation that bad, maybe it's worthwhile. And then there's more text on Overseer of the Dam, which isn't like I don't really care enough that it's like it's not going to be a factor in the decision as to whether this card goes in, I don't think. But whenever a non-token creature an opponent controls dies, make a tapped 2/2 black zombie. Um, it's just like I don't like the zombies are okay. They are fodder, which is nice, but it's not that big a deal. I guess if this is mostly just big chupacabra, then what do I care? But it comes with extra bodies. I don't know. This is why it's in considering. I don't even know if it's that good, and it seems like we're gonna get more good options. I gotta change when I add stuff to considering. I often don't care what version it is because I'm like, well, I don't have any version anyway, so it doesn't matter. But I like to be able to read the cards, so I wouldn't get some of these versions. I already changed the Atali. The default printing was this March of the Machines mess of like, yeah, I hate it. Another card to consider is Rivaz of the Claw. 1 black red 3/3 menace. The 3/3 in Menace is almost certainly irrelevant. Tap, add 2 mana of any combination of colors. You can only use this to cast dragon creature spells. The number one reason why I'm considering this card is because this does exactly what I was saying Worn Powerstone and Coalition Relic are useful for doing. You can go from 3 into 5. Or sorry, 3 into 6 rather. And 3 into 6 mana only for dragons, but I'm trying to cast my commander. That's a dragon. That's fine. There's also more text on this card, which makes it even better. I do actually think this card is good for me. Once during each of your turns, you may cast a dragon creature spell from your graveyard. Some amount of the time, Vaevictis gets expensive enough to cast where I'll let him go to the graveyard and get him back, or it's just more convenient to do it that way, maybe through Eternal Witness or Haunted Crossroads or whatever else. Haunted Crossroads and Vorash Stronghold, by the way, very dangerous to do with Vaevictis. The reason being, once you put it on top of your library, that is the moment where you can decide to put it in the command zone or not. If your library gets shuffled after that, it's just in your library. So while people aren't able to shuffle your library very much, you do have to worry about it a little bit, and so like activate. Like, try to be reasonably certain that they can't do that before you do that. Because if they shuffle Vaevictis away, like you're super boned, and you don't have an opportunity to put it back in the command zone just because your library is getting shuffled. But being able to cast a dragon from the graveyard, that's nice. That means we can cast Vaevictis cheaper. And then when you cast a dragon from your graveyard, it gains when this creature dies, exile it. But if most of the time, that's only going to be Vaevictis. So we can just put it in the command zone. We have a couple of other dragons. We have like Kokusho and Junji or whatever, which we also don't need to rebuy that many times. So being able to cast them from our graveyard is nice. Maybe this would be more important if we had a dragon sub theme in our deck. We don't. At the same time, just being able to cast our commander, make 2 mana for our commander is a pretty big deal. If that's all it does, is that still worthwhile? I guess so. I mean, that's what Warren Power Stone is doing. No, because Warren Power Stone and Coalition Relic do make mana for other stuff too. That's the other thing. Like in other instances, it doesn't actually make that mana, and it doesn't do very much otherwise. I guess we have to consider what dragons we have. That's the one thing that leaves me still on the fence about this. Shieldred is a card that I kind of wanted as soon as I saw it, but the more I think about it, the more I'm a little on the fence. It's 3 black, 4/5 menace. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices a non-token creature. Sack a non-token creature is pretty good, but often that's not different enough than sack a creature to be relevant. In my experience, tokens aren't the things that get in the way of sack a creature being important. Usually it's having non-token creatures that just matter less. They have a random Farhaven off or something. And then there's a flip, but how likely is the flip? And this is why I'm on the fence about her. Having more Fleshback Marauder type effects is nice, and it doesn't make me sack a creature, so like that's the selling point. The things that make me uncertain are what I've already mentioned, and then we should read what the rest of the card is because it could occasionally happen. 4 and a black, exile Shieldred, then return her to the battlefield transformed under its owner's control. Activate only at a sorcery. That's not that big a deal. We mostly operate at sorcery anyway. It's more of the 5 mana. And only if an opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard. We should be able to do that, actually. Yeah, I forgot how easy that is. Getting 8 cards in an opponent's graveyard, we're constantly interacting them. That should be very doable. So the question is, like, how likely are we to spend the mana on flipping this? If we flip this off of Vaevicis, a lot more likely, right? Because we might not have spent mana that turn, especially if we ever untap with Vaevicis, we can just go straight to combat and attack. There's often not a lot I want to do before combat other than maybe get something I'm happy to sacrifice onto the battlefield. Which means having 5 mana left over to flip her, not unlikely. And then the backside is a saga. The first chapter is for each opponent, destroy up to 1 target creature or planeswalker that player controls. That's great. Second chapter, each opponent discards 3 cards, then mills 3 cards. Phenomenal. They'll be on almost no resources. And then the third one is put all creature cards from all graveyards onto the battlefield under your control, exile this and return to the battlefield, and then return to the battlefield. That's pretty game ending. Yeah, I guess Shieldred is good enough. Like, yeah, okay. Well, we're gonna want to get a copy of that one. Some of these cards were things I came across when I was going through EDH Rec yesterday. So like Cream of the Crop, I actually don't think is worthwhile, but maybe I think if we're gonna go deeper on card selection, then we want Miri's Guile. By the way, I didn't see this on EDH Rec, I don't think. Maybe it wasn't. I just didn't think about it that much. But Cream of the Crop is another way of doing that. It's 1 and a green. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may look at the top X cards of your library, where X is its power. If you do, put one of those cards on top of your library and the rest on the bottom in a random order. So here's the thing. It doesn't give you card advantage. It just reselects cards. You can only put 1 on top. So if you see 2 good cards, well, you got to pick. You have to put 1, so if you see only cards you don't want, you still have to draw one of them. Incidentally, with a 1 power creature, you just look at the top card of your library. That's all it really does. But it does give you some amount of cards. And then it also means for it to affect our Vaevicis triggers, we have to play something with moderately large power to get a big enough trigger where we can find something. Yeah, never mind. We're off of it. If we're going to add more deck manipulation, it's going to be Miri's Guile and not Cream of the Crop. Binding of the Old Gods was the exact saga I was thinking of when I was mentioning that the unfortunate part of the Eldest Reborn is that we can't both sacrifice it and get the best part of the saga. Because the binding of the... it's not Binding of the Old Gods. I always say that. It's Binding the Old Gods. We get the best parts. The best parts are chapters 1 and 2. So, and it comes with stuff we already want to do. So it's 2... black, green, destroy target non-land permanent opponent controls. Great. We already want that. That's already stuff we want to do in our deck on a permanent, so we can flip it to Vaevicis, blow up a thing. Awesome. Chapter 2, search your library for forest, put on the battlefield, tapped. So Forest obviously means that we can't get whatever land we want, but Zeotoro's Proving Ground, the Triome, that's a forest. Any of our shock lands, those are forests. I happen to have a Bayou, that's a forest. So it's a little bit of fixing. It's not consistently fixing, right? We're, some number of like if we already have our Stomping Ground, we can't get red. I think, or if we already have Stomping Ground and Zeotoro's Proving Ground, I don't think we can get red. I don't think there are any other uh, non-basic mountains in the deck, but it's fine. Though I guess if we have those two, we already have double red, so do we need it? And then the last chapter is creatures you control gain death touch until end of turn. I just do not care about that. So we can get this at some point, either cast it or flip it off of Vaevictis, blow up a thing, go to our next turn, get a land, sack it to Vaevictis. Seems great. I just need a copy. We just talked about Mirror's Guile. Virtue. It's interesting. Like some cards will like stay. It will get scrolled past, and some won't. Virtue of Persistence is another card. I was just looking at new cards yesterday and seeing what would be good. I think it would be really good in this deck, and it does a lot of stuff that I wish we had access to. So it has an adventure. The adventure part is a sorcery, so we have access to spells. Unfortunately, it's not an instant, which it would probably be too good at instant, but cool. We have access to a spell. It does something, and much cheaper than a creature that would do the same thing. Maybe for the same reason, like Murderous Rider is worth considering, but I just think both halves of that card are too bad and too dorky. I don't like. I guess we can, when we sacrifice the creature part, it goes back into our library, but it's not like we can get it from there anyway. Back to the Virtue of Persistence. Lochthwain Scorn. 1 in a black sorcery. Target creature gets -3/-3 until end of turn. You gain 2 life. Sure, it's fine. The fact it's just a free thing that it's a thing we get. We can incidentally use and then eventually cast the enchantment part of that. If we don't get it because we flip it off of Vaevictis, we don't mind that much. It's just a nice to have. This card is almost playable if it doesn't have it. In fact, I've played a card very, very similar to this, unironically, that didn't have that, which is Debtor's Knell. But that was a very different deck, and we also don't get access to that card in this deck. But then the actual enchantment part, 5 black. Also, how does an enchantment go on an adventure? Anyway, at the beginning of your upkeep, put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. It's great. It's fantastic. No notes. It's just a phenomenal effect. It's a little expensive to get, but sometimes we'll get it off of Vaevictis, and if we don't want to cast it, like we can cast, if it's in our hand, we can cast the sorcery part and eventually get to it. Seems good. And I need to relook at the mana, the land base. I know I never go over the mana, the specific land choices for fixing in my deck, but I know that my fixing is kind of in a bad spot right now in this one. So why don't we go over it just to be thorough? For the most part, it doesn't much matter. The big thing is just I try to stay away from lands that enter tapped. And if they have a condition to enter tapped, I want that condition to at least be reasonable to accomplish. So like shock lands, you can pay 2 life if you need to. Check lands, well, you'll probably have some number of shock lands or your Triome or whatever. So like, okay, that comes in tapped. But then they're like, here are the lands that get in the way. Arcane Lighthouse, Detection Tower, Bojuka Bog only making black. It's basically just another swamp, right? So Bojuka Bog, our basics, Field of the Dead, Handwear Battlements, the Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse come in tapped, so that's a thing. Care Keep makes colorless. Colony Garden is basically another forest. Mosswarp Bridge and Spine Rock Knoll are basically single color lands, though I was just talking about those coming out. Okina is a single color land. Riveteer's Outlook gets the land tapped. Savage Lands is tapped. Zeotoro's Proving Ground is tapped. Volrath Stronghold is colorless. Temple of the False God is colorless. So I just need a lot more. I want better fixing in this deck. Now that there's an enemy color, there are enemy color versions of this cycle. We can add in the Undergrowth Stadium. I just need to get a copy. And I think I need to put more like green-black non-basics in here. But of course, I don't want them to come in tapped most of the time. So this is actually why I ended up cutting from a lot of my decks the Battle for Zendikar lands that come into play tapped unless you have 2 or more basic lands. You could get away with that. It depends on your deck. If your deck has a lot of basic lands, then it's fine. You can do that. But if your deck doesn't, like this one doesn't, because we're trying to enable Field of the Dead, then, well, no, those just come into play tapped. So I'm not going to play those. Same with like the Amonkhet cycling lands. Those just enter tapped. We're not playing them. So I'll praise this. I'm not going to do this on stream. It's annoying enough that I'm like going over it all. The mana base is just it's important, but not so much so that we want to go through like card by card. So that's Vaevictis. This is the deck that I'm least happy with at the moment, and that's probably a result of it getting the least active attention out of any of my decks if uh, in the most recent period of time. Uh, there's a lot of cool stuff going for it. I like how fair the game plan is. I like how interactive it is. It's sometimes oppressively interactive, and uh, that does kind of suck. I do recognize that my opponents are often in positions a lot of the time where they just can't do anything and have to wait for me to take the turns to kill them with commander damage. So that's another thing maybe we want is something that ends the game a little bit more quickly. I don't want like a combo kill, but maybe something that just represents a lot of pressure for my opponents. Field of the Dead is reasonable in that way. I think some of the cards we were considering, like Shieldred is a really good mechanism for that, so maybe that's another reason to put that in. Portal to Phyrexia similarly. Virtue of Persistence similarly. Maybe that should be enough. Yeah, I think a lot of these need to come in. And I think if we're putting in Itali, Portal to Phyrexia, Virtue of Persistence, then we almost certainly don't want Overseer of the Damned. And we can be a little more free to cut one or two of our big things, like the Sepulchral Primordial. I'm most excited about this Portal to Phyrexia. That's got to be so, so, so good. Well, those are the deck techs. I hope you found them interesting. I know it's kind of grueling to get through. I am very worn out at this point for having gotten two of them that actually took a little bit longer than usual. Probably because there are so much more to say about these decks than some of the other ones we went over. There's a lot of connected parts, a lot of or in the case of Vaevictis, there's a lot of stuff that needs to be worked on, and I just haven't in a while. So we'll do that. I mean, that's just kind of the difficulty of maintaining too many decks. I try not to very much. For the longest time, I only had I shouldn't say only, but I had like 3 or 4 decks, but that was it. I wasn't going to try to maintain past that. And different decks are more or less, are more easier or harder to maintain. With Mael, I can mostly just like look at what new 5-power creatures come out in the colors and then move on. But with this, like sometimes you have to, like sometimes a card comes out which makes a card you rejected earlier better, or you also have to like look at only the permanent, but every permanent in these colors. Yeah, there's a lot to it. So this deck is just not well maintained, and that's what we're seeing here. But that said, I did want to get it onto the stream and into my video catalogs and onto Moxfield so that, all right, here we are. If anyone wants to know what my decks are and what's going on and what the thought process is and why I did what I did, now you know. It's here. Part of my inclination to do this was actually the last time I went to my local game shop, someone was playing Tatyova. I was like, oh, should I play mine? And there were some different ideas about what was going on. And I told them like, and we didn't really have time for me to just hand him the deck and let him go through it. So I was like, all right, well, I'll put the full explanation on here. It's the last of my, will be with the last of my decks that I need to do a deck tech for anyway. And now it's all up here. As I mentioned at the start of the stream, I may do a deck tech for Hilda in the future. We built it on stream, but a lot has changed since then, and also like, for one, we didn't finish building it. Like 30 cards needed to get cut after we finished that stream, which took quite a while to do. But then also some of the thoughts and ideas have changed after playing the deck a little bit, which is something that's just always going to happen, right? You play the deck and you realize some of how you thought things would work just don't work that way, and like the game progresses in a different way than you expected. So such as it is. In any case, I hope everyone had a good time with this. The plan for tomorrow is to do These Are the Questions. We missed out on it last week, almost exclusively due to my bad scheduling. But I'm pretty sure Hexic is free tomorrow, and I'm gonna double check to see if my guest is available to join us as well. But if it's just Hexic, I mean that's normally how we do it, so that'll be a great time. And then we'll try to do every other week from there, which does line up because next week I'm out of town, so don't expect me to stream. I won't be around. It will be Thanksgiving week, so Well, I'll say it again tomorrow, as this will be the last I see you before Thanksgiving. But I hope you have a great Thanksgiving. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will catch you next time. Bye.